Tonight, I find myself remembering the frozen plains of Manchuria in the 1930s, the way bitter wind swept across endless snow, and how silence could hide the most terrible secrets. This is history as it was lived hidden, bureaucratic, unthinkably cruel. If this quiet approach to these darkest chapters helps you understand how evil can wear the mask of science, a like would mean a lot. Subscribe if you'd like to join me for more slow journeys through history's shadows. Tell me in the comments where tonight finds you listening. What draws you to these forgotten atrocities that shaped our world? Dim the lights. Let's drift back to Pingfang, where medicine became murder. I remember the lecture halls of Kyoto Imperial University in the 1920s, the way formaldehyde hung in the air like incense in a temple of science, and how the scratch of chalk on blackboard marked time in a world where brilliant minds gathered to heal. Back then, medicine was supposed to be about saving lives. The students bent over their microscopes in those quiet corridors, their futures stretching ahead like promises written in careful script, had no way of knowing that one among them would twist everything they learned into something monstrous. His name was Shiro Ishii, and I remember him as a man who smiled easily and spoke softly about things that should have made him weep. Born into wealth in 1885, raised on land that his family had owned for generations, Ishii moved through his early life with the confidence that comes from never wanting for anything material. But there was something else in him, something that his classmates at Kyoto noticed even then in fascination, that went beyond the normal bounds of scientific curiosity. While other medical students dissected their cadavers with the reverence due to the dead, Ishii grew bacteria in petri dishes like other men might raise pets. He would tend to his cultures with an almost parental care, watching them multiply and spread with eyes that held more warmth for microorganisms than they ever would for human beings. His professors remembered this about him, the way he could spend hours observing the dance of death that played out in those glass circles, disease consuming whatever medium he had prepared for it. The world around Ishii was trying to forget what war could do to human flesh. The Great War had ended just a few years before, and the memory of gas attacks in the trenches of France still woke men from sleep, choking on phantom poison that filled their lungs like liquid fear. In 1925, nations gathered in Geneva to sign a protocol that would ban the use of chemical and biological weapons in warfare, a collective promise that the horrors they had witnessed would never be unleashed again. The document spoke of asphyxiating, poisonous or other gases, and of bacteriological methods of warfare, words that seemed to close the door on a particularly cruel chapter of human ingenuity. Japan signed that protocol. The emperor's representatives put their names to paper alongside delegates from other civilized nations, and the world believed that another small step had been taken away from barbarism. But signatures on paper are only as strong as the will behind them. And back in Tokyo, the Japanese Diet never ratified the agreement. It was a small, bureaucratic detail, the kind of legal technicality that gets buried in parliamentary procedure, but it left a door open that Ishii would eventually walk through. By 1927, while his former classmates were setting up practices and learning the art of bedside manner, Ishii was already advocating for something entirely different. He had studied the Geneva Protocol carefully, and where others saw humanitarian progress, he saw military opportunity. If the civilized world had banned biological weapons, He reasoned with the cold logic that would define his career, then they must be devastatingly effective. Why else would nations go to such lengths to prohibit them? This reasoning led him on a journey that would take him far from the quiet halls of Kyoto. For 2 years, beginning in 1928, Ishii traveled through the Western world like a medical student on an extended fellowship. He visited laboratories in Europe and America, attended lectures, took tours of research facilities, and asked questions that his hosts were happy to answer. I remember the sound of steam locomotives crossing the frozen Manchurian landscape in 1931. The way their whistles cut through air so cold it seemed to shatter like glass, and how the crunch of military boots on snow marked the beginning of something that would change the very meaning of medical research. Back then, conquest still moved at the pace of marching men and supply trains, but the ideas that rode with those armies moved faster than any locomotive, carrying plans that would transform distant villages into laboratories of unimaginable cruelty. The Japanese invasion of Manchuria had begun on a September night with an explosion on the railway tracks near Mukden, a blast so small that the train it was meant to derail barely even slowed down. But explosions have their own logic in times when nations are looking for reasons to fight. This tiny detonation became the justification for an entire army to cross into Chinese territory. Within months, the Kwantung Army had swept across the vast northeastern provinces, establishing a puppet state they called Manchukuo, and creating, almost as an afterthought, the perfect conditions for Shiro Ishii's vision to take root. What made Manchuria so appealing to men like Ishii was not just its remoteness, though the endless plains and harsh winters certainly provided isolation from prying eyes. It was a legal peculiarity that most people would never think to notice, a bureaucratic detail buried in Japanese law that made all the difference between theory and practice. You see, it was illegal under Japanese domestic law to conduct human experimentation on Japanese citizens or to perform such experiments within Japan itself. The law was clear on this point, reflecting standards of medical ethics that had evolved over centuries of civilized practice. But Manchuria was not Japan, not in any legal sense that mattered to military lawyers and government officials looking for loopholes. It was occupied territory, administered by Japanese authorities, but existing in a kind of legal twilight where the normal rules did not necessarily apply. The people who lived there, Chinese farmers and merchants, Korean laborers, Mongolian herders, Russian refugees, were not Japanese citizens. They had no protection under Japanese law, no recourse to Japanese courts, no voice in Japanese politics. They were, in the clinical terminology that Ishii and his colleagues would adopt, simply available. This was not an accident or an oversight. It was a calculated decision by the Japanese state to externalize its most heinous activities, to create a space where the unthinkable could become routine and where atrocities could be committed without legal consequence. The invasion of Manchuria provided more than just strategic territory and natural resources. It provided a human laboratory where the ethical constraints of civilization could be discarded as easily as yesterday's newspapers. Ishii understood this opportunity immediately. Within 2 years of the invasion, he had established his first facility in a village southeast of Harbin, a place so remote that most maps of the time did not even show its name. He called his operation the Togo Unit, a designation that revealed nothing about its true purpose. and he housed it in a building that had once produced soy sauce for local consumption. The conversion was not difficult. Storage rooms became laboratories, fermentation tanks became culture vessels, and the loading docks, where workers had once shipped bottles of seasoning, became the entry point for a different kind of cargo entirely. The irony was lost on no one who knew what was happening inside those converted walls. A facility that had once nourished life was now devoted to perfecting death, and the same chemical processes that had created flavor were being adapted to create agony. But irony was a luxury that the victims of the Togo unit could not afford, and by 1934, the building that had once smelled of fermented soybeans had taken on an entirely different odor. The early experiments conducted in the Togo unit were crude by the standards that Ishii would later develop, but they served their purpose as proof of concept. Chinese prisoners captured by the Kempeitai on charges that were never formally filed disappeared into the converted factory and provided the first data points in what would become the most comprehensive study of human suffering ever undertaken in the name of science. The work was secret, the methods were brutal, and the results were carefully documented in reports that found their way back to Tokyo, where senior military officials read them with the same attention they might give to weather forecasts or supply inventories. But secrecy, Ishii had learned, was a fragile thing. In 1934, his carefully controlled environment was shattered when a group of Chinese prisoners managed to escape from the Togo unit. The details of their flight were never fully recorded, whether they had overpowered guards, found a weakness in the facility's security, or simply been helped by sympathetic local villagers. What mattered was that they were free, and with their freedom came the possibility that word of what was happening in the converted soy sauce factory might reach the outside world. The escape forced Ishii to make a decision that revealed both his pragmatism and his commitment to the work he had begun. Rather than abandon the project or attempt to contain the damage through negotiation or bribery, he chose to destroy all evidence of the Togo unit's activities and relocate the entire operation. The building was systematically stripped of anything that might suggest its true purpose, and the remaining prisoners were disposed of in ways that left no witnesses to testify about what they had experienced. The Togo unit's staff and equipment were temporarily moved back to the Army Military Medical School in Tokyo, where Ishii could regroup and plan his next steps under the protection of official military facilities. But this was always intended as a temporary arrangement. Ishii had learned valuable lessons from the failure of his first facility, and he was already envisioning something far more ambitious and secure than a converted factory in a remote village. What he needed was not just isolation, but institutional support. Not just a building, but a complex. Not just secrecy, but official sanction from the highest levels of government. The escape from the Togo unit had been a setback, but it had also been an education in the requirements for conducting human experimentation on the scale that Ishii envisioned. As 1934 turned to 1935, and the temporary relocation to Tokyo stretched through months of planning and preparation, Ishii worked tirelessly to secure the resources and authorization he needed for his next attempt. He had learned that half measures would not suffice, that improvised facilities could not contain the scope of his ambitions, and that the work he intended to do required not just official approval, but official enthusiasm from the very highest levels of the Japanese government. The frozen plains of Manchuria waited for his return like a patient stretched out on an operating table. In villages across the region, families went about their daily lives unaware that their futures were being planned in conference rooms thousands of miles away, where men in uniform studied maps and discussed the most efficient methods for acquiring experimental subjects. The snow continued to fall, covering the ground where Ishii's permanent facility would soon rise. And in the silence of those winter nights, no one could hear the sound of blueprints being drawn for buildings that would redefine the very concept of human cruelty. The quiet doctor had learned his first lesson in the practical application of evil, and he was ready to build something that would ensure such lessons never had to be repeated. Somewhere in the administrative machinery of Tokyo, approvals were being signed and budgets were being allocated for a project that would dwarf the converted soy sauce factory in every possible dimension. The Togo unit had been an experiment in itself, a pilot program for something far more systematic and far more terrible. In the distance, across the frozen landscape where families still gathered around their fires and told their children stories to pass the long winter nights, the sound of construction equipment was already beginning to echo. The opportunity that Manchuria represented was about to be fully realized, and the legal loopholes that had made the Togo unit possible were about to be exploited on a scale that would challenge every assumption about the limits of institutional evil. I remember the sound of construction in Pingfang district in 1936, the way hammers rang against steel beams in the crisp Manchurian air, and how the rhythmic pouring of concrete seemed to mark time like a metronome counting out the beats of approaching horror. Back then, building sites were places of creation, where architects' dreams took shape in wood and stone and the sweat of honest labor. But there was something different about this particular construction project, something that even the workers sensed as they laid foundations for buildings whose true purpose they could never have imagined. The authorization had come from the very top. On August 1st, 1936, Emperor Hirohito himself had signed the order establishing what would be known to the world as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. The bureaucratic language was deliberately mundane, the kind of administrative terminology that could pass through military channels without attracting attention or raising questions. It sounded like exactly the sort of public health initiative that any responsible occupying force might establish in territory prone to cholera outbreaks and water contamination. But those of us who remember that time know that the most terrible deeds often hide behind the most benign descriptions. What Hirohito had actually authorized was something unprecedented in the history of human cruelty as state-sponsored program of medical experimentation that would dwarf every atrocity that had come before it. Shiro Ishii had finally secured the institutional support he needed, and with the emperor's signature on official documents, his vision could be transformed from theory into concrete and steel. The site chosen for this transformation was a district called Pingfang, about 20 kilometers south of Harbin City. It was remote enough to ensure privacy, but accessible enough to allow for the transportation of supplies, equipment, and the human cargo that would feed Ishii's research. The land was flat and open, perfect for the kind of massive construction project that Ishii envisioned, and the bitter Manchurian winters would provide natural isolation for months at a time. What rose from that frozen ground was not a single building but an entire complex, a city of death that sprawled across more than 6 square kilometers of Manchurian countryside. 150 buildings in total, each designed for a specific function in the systematic study of human suffering. There were laboratories equipped with the finest medical equipment that could be procured from Germany and Japan, dormitories for the 3,000 staff members who would work there, administrative offices for the bureaucrats who would manage the killing, and even recreational facilities for the men and women who would spend their days perfecting new forms of torture. The scope of the construction project was staggering. 2 airports were built to facilitate the transportation of personnel and experimental materials, their runways oriented to account for the prevailing winds that swept across the plains. Railway lines were extended to connect the facility directly to the main transportation networks, allowing for the discreet movement of both supplies and victims. Power plants and water treatment facilities were constructed to ensure that the complex could operate independently, cut off from the outside world, but never lacking the resources necessary for its grim work. I remember thinking about the architects who drew up those plans, the engineers who calculated load-bearing capacities and drainage systems, the contractors who bid on construction jobs without knowing they were building chambers of death. There is something particularly chilling about the mundane professionalism that went into creating such a place. The way that ordinary construction workers could unknowingly participate in the creation of something so extraordinary in its evil. The buildings themselves were designed with a clinical efficiency that reflected Ishii's scientific training. The main laboratory complex featured operating theaters that looked exactly like what you might find in any modern hospital, complete with surgical lights, anesthesia equipment that would never be used for its intended purpose, and observation galleries where medical students could watch demonstrations of techniques that violated every principle of their Hippocratic oath. There were incubation chambers for growing bacterial cultures, freezing units for frostbite experiments, and specially constructed cells designed to house human subjects in conditions that maximized their suffering while keeping them alive for extended periods of study. But the Pingfeng complex was just the centerpiece of what Ishii called his network of death. Branch facilities were constructed throughout, Japanese-occupied territory, each specializing in different aspects of biological and chemical weapons research. Unit 100 in Changchun focused on animal diseases that could destroy enemy agriculture and livestock. Unit 200 near Mukden worked on chemical weapons development. Smaller facilities in Mongolia and northern China provided specialized services and served as field testing sites for new techniques developed at Pingfeng. This network approach revealed the institutional nature of what Ishii was building. This was not the work of a single mad scientist, but rather a systematic program involving thousands of participants and backed by the full resources of the Japanese military-industrial complex. The scale of the operation required not just official authorization, but active collaboration from every level of Japanese society. From the emperor who signed the orders to the medical students who volunteered to participate in research that they believed would bring glory to Japan and advance the cause of science. The recruitment of personnel for this enterprise was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire project. Ishii did not have to rely on criminals or outcasts to staff his facilities. Instead, he was able to draw from the finest medical schools and universities in Japan, attracting brilliant young doctors and researchers who saw an opportunity to work on the cutting edge of medical science. Tokyo Imperial University, Kyoto Imperial University, and other prestigious institutions became recruiting grounds for a project that would pervert everything these students had been taught about the purpose of medicine. The academic credentials of Ishii's staff were impeccable. Many held advanced degrees in bacteriology, pathology, and other medical specialties. They published papers in respected journals, attended international conferences, and maintained the outward appearance of legitimate researchers throughout their involvement in systematic murder. This was not a rogue operation conducted by medical misfits, but rather the collaborative effort of Japan's medical establishment, a profession that had collectively decided to abandon its ethical foundations in service of nationalist ideology and military ambition. What made this collaboration possible was the same institutional framework that allowed the Pingfang complex to be built in the first place. The Japanese state had created a bureaucratic structure that could transform individual acts of cruelty into systematic policy, that could take the natural human reluctance to inflict suffering and overcome it through official orders, peer pressure, and the promise of career advancement. Young doctors who might have balked at torturing a single patient could participate in the torture of thousands when it was presented as legitimate research conducted under imperial authority for the defense of Japan. The transformation of these medical professionals was gradual and deliberate. They began with animal experiments that seemed to have legitimate scientific value, gradually progressing to human subjects as the institutional culture normalized what had once been unthinkable. They were taught to use clinical language that obscured the reality of what they were doing, to think of their subjects as experimental materials rather than human beings, and to measure their success by the quality of their data rather than the welfare of their patients. By the time construction of the Pingfang complex was completed in late 1936, Ishii had assembled what was arguably the most sophisticated medical research operation in the world. The facilities were state-of-the-art, the equipment was cutting-edge, and the staff included some of the most brilliant minds in Japanese medicine. From the outside, it looked like exactly what its cover story claimed it to be: a public health facility dedicated to preventing disease and ensuring clean water for the occupying forces. But those of us who remember that time know that the most dangerous lies are the ones that contain just enough truth to be believable. The Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department did conduct research on preventing disease, but only to learn how to create more effective epidemics. It did work on water purification, but only to develop better methods for contaminating enemy water supplies. Every legitimate medical activity conducted at Pingfang was simply a cover for its opposite, a way of maintaining the appearance of scientific respectability while pursuing the systematic perfection of human suffering. The snow continued to fall on the completed complex as 1936 turned to 1937, covering the buildings and runways with the same white silence that had blanketed the region for centuries. But underneath that peaceful facade, the infrastructure of atrocity was finally in place. The laboratories were equipped, the staff was trained, and the bureaucratic mechanisms were functioning smoothly. All that remained was to begin the systematic acquisition and processing of human experimental subjects. In villages throughout Manchuria, families went about their daily routines, unaware that their lives had become commodities in a supply chain designed to feed Ishii's research programs. The arbitrary arrests would begin soon. The cattle cars would start rolling toward Pingfang, and the careful documentation of systematic murder would commence with all the precision and attention to detail that characterized Japanese institutional culture. The quiet doctor had finally built his dream facility, a place where medicine could be practiced without ethical constraints and where scientific curiosity could be pursued without regard for human suffering. The construction phase was complete. The death factory was ready for operation. And somewhere in the administrative offices of the Pingfang complex, schedules were being drawn up for the delivery of the human raw materials that would feed its terrible machinery. What had been built there was more than just a research facility. It was a monument to the institutional capacity for evil, proof that civilization's greatest achievements, science, medicine, bureaucracy, could be turned into instruments of unprecedented cruelty, when the moral foundations that should constrain them were deliberately removed. The hammering and concrete pouring had stopped, but the sound they had made would echo through history as the rhythm of calculated brutality transformed into systematic policy. The factory was built. Now it needed logs. I remember the sound of cell doors slamming shut in the basement levels of the Pingfang complex, the way metal echoed against concrete in corridors that had been designed to muffle screams, and how footsteps could disappear into silence so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. Back then, prisons were supposed to be places of punishment and rehabilitation, where society's judgment was carried out according to law and custom. But what had been built beneath the medical laboratories of Unit 731 was something entirely different, processing facility, where human beings were transformed into experimental materials through the simple expedient of calling them by a different name. They called them Maruta logs. The word choice was not accidental, not some casual slang that developed organically among the staff. It was a deliberate policy decision, implemented by Ishui himself as part of a systematic program of dehumanization that would allow medical professionals to bypass every ethical constraint that might otherwise interfere with their work. By referring to prisoners as logs, the staff could discuss their disposal, transportation, and consumption with the same clinical detachment they might apply to any other laboratory supply. How many logs did you cut down today? The question became as routine as asking about the weather, a casual inquiry that colleagues might make over lunch or during evening conversations in the staff dormitories. We need fresh logs for tomorrow's experiment. These logs are getting too old for reliable data. Make sure to number the logs before you begin. The procedure, the language itself, became a weapon, a tool for transforming murder into inventory management and torture into quality control. But words, however carefully chosen, could not entirely obscure the reality of what those logs had been before they entered the Pingfang complex. They had been farmers tending their fields, merchants selling goods in village markets, students walking to school, mothers nursing their children. They had been Chinese civilians caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, Korean laborers who had asked too many questions, Mongolian herders who had wandered too close to Japanese patrol routes, Russian refugees who had fled one form of persecution only to encounter something far worse. The acquisition of these experimental subjects was handled with the same bureaucratic efficiency that characterized every other aspect of Unit 731's operations. The Kempeitai, Japan's military police, maintained a steady supply chain of human materials through a system of arbitrary arrests that required no warrants, no charges, and no legal proceedings of any kind. Suspected of anti-Japanese activity, into the cattle car, caught near a military installation, into the cattle car, related to someone who had been previously arrested, into the cattle car. The criteria for selection was so broad and so loosely applied that virtually anyone living in Japanese-occupied territory could become a log at any moment. The transportation of these prisoners to Pingfang was conducted with the same attention to secrecy that characterized the facility's construction. Special railway cars, windowless and reinforced, carried their human cargo across the Manchurian countryside under cover of darkness. The loading and unloading was done by personnel who had been briefed on the importance of discretion, and the manifest documents listed the contents of these shipments using the same coded language that would later be applied within the facility itself. Upon arrival at Pingfang, the transformation from human being to experimental material was completed through a process that had been refined through months of practice. Prisoners were stripped of their clothing, their possessions, and their names, receiving instead numerical designations that would follow them through whatever remained of their lives. They were photographed from multiple angles, weighed and measured, and subjected to initial medical examinations that documented their baseline health status for future reference. The housing system that awaited them had been designed with the specific requirements of long-term human experimentation in mind. The log cabins, as the staff called them with characteristic dark humor, were individual cells constructed to precise specifications that balanced the need for security against the importance of maintaining experimental subjects in useful condition. Each cell was large enough to prevent the psychological breakdown that might compromise research data, but small enough to ensure that escape was impossible and resistance was futile. The cells were arranged in blocks that could be isolated from each other when necessary, preventing the spread of infectious diseases between experimental groups and ensuring that contamination of controlled subjects would not invalidate research results. Temperature, humidity, and air circulation could be controlled independently for each block, allowing researchers to study the effects of environmental factors on disease progression or to create optimal conditions for specific types of experiments. What made this dehumanization system particularly effective was the way it operated on multiple levels simultaneously. The prisoners were stripped not just of their names and possessions, but of every marker of individual identity that might trigger empathy in their handlers. They wore identical uniforms, received identical rations, and followed identical daily routines that reduced them to a series of biological functions that could be monitored, measured, and manipulated according to experimental protocols. The staff, meanwhile, were protected from psychological stress through a carefully constructed system of intellectual barriers that prevented them from fully confronting the reality of what they were doing. They were taught to think in terms of experimental design rather than individual suffering, to focus on data collection rather than patient welfare, and to measure success by the quality of their research rather than the impact on their subjects. This psychological insulation was reinforced through the institutional culture that Ishii had created within the facility. Medical professionals who might have balked at inflicting pain on a patient could participate in systematic torture when it was presented as legitimate research conducted under proper scientific protocols. The same training that had taught them to make difficult decisions in the interests of medical knowledge could be redirected toward decisions that violated every principle of medical ethics. The scientific method itself became complicit in this process of dehumanization. The requirement for controlled experiments meant that some prisoners would receive experimental treatments, while others served as controls, creating an artificial distinction between subjects that was based entirely on research needs rather than any consideration of their individual circumstances or preferences. The need for statistical significance meant that experiments had to be repeated multiple times with different subjects, transforming individual acts of cruelty into systematic programs of abuse. Record-keeping became another tool for maintaining psychological distance between the perpetrators and their victim. Every aspect of the prisoner's deterioration was carefully documented in clinical language that focused on observable phenomena rather than subjective experience. Temperature readings, blood pressure measurements, tissue samples, and behavioral observations were recorded with the same meticulous attention to detail that characterized legitimate medical research, creating vast archives of suffering disguised as scientific data. The prisoners themselves were not passive recipients of this systematic dehumanization. Many attempted to maintain their dignity and humanity despite the conditions imposed upon them, sharing food when possible, comforting each other during moments of despair, and preserving whatever memories they could of the lives they had lived before their capture. But the system had been designed to break down exactly these forms of resistance, and the isolation, malnutrition, and constant threat of painful death gradually wore away at even the strongest spirits. Some prisoners tried to communicate with their captors, pleading for mercy or attempting to establish human connections that might save them from the worst fates. But the staff had been trained to ignore such appeals, to treat any display of personality or emotion as simply another data point to be recorded and analyzed. The system rewarded professional detachment and punished any sign of empathy or hesitation. As 1937 progressed and the facility reached full operational capacity, the steady flow of new logs into the Pingfang complex became as regular and predictable as any other aspect of the research program. Transportation schedules were coordinated with experimental timings, ensuring that fresh subjects would always be available when needed. Storage capacity was expanded to accommodate larger inventories of human materials, and processing procedures were streamlined to reduce the time between arrival and initial experimentation. The casual cruelty of this system was perhaps most evident in the way staff members discussed their work during off-duty hours. Conversations that should have been weighed down by moral horror were instead marked by the same professional concerns that might occupy any group of researchers' worries about funding, complaints about bureaucratic interference, speculation about career advancement opportunities. The systematic dehumanization had succeeded so completely that the human cost of their work had become invisible even to those who inflicted it daily. In the villages surrounding Pingfang, families continued to disappear with increasing frequency as the facility's appetite for experimental subjects grew. Children walked to school wondering if their parents would be there when they returned. Parents sent their children on errands while fearing they might never see them again. The entire region lived under a cloud of arbitrary terror that transformed every interaction with Japanese authorities into a potentially fatal encounter. But within the walls of Unit 731, this human tragedy had been successfully transformed into scientific opportunity. The logs were numbered, catalogued, and ready for use. The experimental protocols had been developed and refined. The data collection systems were functioning efficiently. All that remained was to begin the systematic study of human suffering that would occupy the facility for the remainder of its existence. The quiet doctor had solved the final logistical challenge in his program of institutionalized atrocity. The question of experimental subjects, which might have limited the scope of his research, had been resolved through the simple expedient of redefining human beings as laboratory supplies. The sound of cell doors slamming shut had become as routine as any other aspect of the facility's daily operations, and the echoes of those doors would soon be joined by sounds that no medical facility should ever contain. Somewhere in the administrative offices of Pinkfang, schedules were being drawn up for the first systematic experiments on living human subjects, procedures that would test the limits of scientific curiosity and the capacity of institutional evil. I remember the sound of surgical instruments clinking against metal trays in the operating theaters of Pinkfang, the deliberate precision of scalpels being arranged in order of size, and how the absence of certain sounds, the hiss of anesthesia machines, the gentle reassurance of medical voices created a silence that was more terrible than any scream. Back then, operating rooms were supposed to be places of healing, where skilled hands worked to preserve life, and the careful administration of pain relief allowed the body to endure what was necessary for recovery. But in the basement laboratories of Unit 731, those same surgical skills had been turned toward an entirely different purpose. They called it vivisection, though that clinical term could barely contain the reality of what took place on those steel tables under the bright surgical lights. Vivisection, the dissection of living subjects, had become the central practice of Ishii's research program, the procedure that would generate the most valuable data about human anatomy, physiology, and the progression of disease. It was, the staff were told, impossible to understand how the human body truly functioned by studying corpses, where death had already altered the very processes they sought to observe. The logic was impeccable from a purely scientific standpoint. Dead tissue responds differently to infection than living tissue. Post-mortem examination cannot reveal how organs function under stress, how diseases spread through active circulatory systems, or how the immune response develops in real time. If the goal was to understand the human machine in its full complexity, then that machine had to remain operational throughout the entire research process. What this meant, in the stark language of medical procedure, was that prisoners would be strapped to operating tables while fully conscious and systematically dissected while their hearts still beat and their minds still functioned. No anesthesia would be administered, not from any shortage of supplies or lack of medical knowledge, but because unconsciousness might interfere with the researchers' ability to observe and record the subject's responses to various stimuli. The policy had been established by Ishii himself, codified in written protocols that were distributed to all medical staff. Anesthesia, these documents explained, could alter blood pressure, heart rate, and other physiological indicators that were essential to accurate data collection. Pain responses provided valuable information about nervous system function. The subject's ability to communicate during procedures allowed researchers to gather subjective data that would otherwise be lost. Every detail of conscious suffering had been justified through scientific reasoning that transformed torture into methodology. Dr. Ken Uemasa, one of the few staff members who would later speak openly about his experiences at Pinkfang, remembered his first vivisection with the kind of clinical precision that characterized all Unit 731 documentation. The subject was a Chinese prisoner who had been infected with plague several days earlier, allowing the researchers to observe the disease's progression through direct examination of internal organs. While they remained functional, the procedure began with careful external examination and measurement, the same routine that might precede any medical operation. Temperature, pulse, blood pressure, and respiratory rate were recorded in meticulous detail. Photographs were taken from multiple angles to document the subject's condition at the start of the experiment. Then came the first incision, a precise cut that opened the abdomen to reveal the organs beneath. What followed was a systematic exploration of a living human body, conducted with the same methodical approach that medical students might apply to a cadaver, except that this particular specimen continued to breathe, to bleed, and to respond to the researchers' manipulations. Each organ was examined in turn, removed when necessary for closer study, weighed and measured and photographed before being set aside for further analysis. The heart continued to beat even after the chest cavity had been opened and the lungs exposed. The researchers could observe directly how plague infection had affected cardiac function, how the disease had spread through the circulatory system, and how various organs had attempted to compensate for the damage. This was data that could never have been obtained from post-mortem examination, information that would prove invaluable for understanding how biological weapons might affect enemy populations. The subject remained conscious throughout most of the procedure, providing verbal responses to questions about pain levels, visual clarity, and other subjective experiences that the researchers needed to document. Only when blood loss finally reached critical levels did awareness begin to fade, and even then the process continued until cardiac arrest made further observation impossible. This was not an isolated incident or an exceptional case that pushed beyond normal boundaries. It was standard operating procedure, repeated day after day with different subjects and different experimental variables. Some prisoners were infected with various diseases before vivisection to study the effects of specific pathogens. Others underwent the procedure while healthy, providing baseline data about normal human physiology under extreme stress. Pregnant women represented a particularly valuable research opportunity, as their condition allowed for the simultaneous study of two subjects. I remember the sound of laboratory equipment humming in the research wings of Ping Fang, the gentle vibration of incubators maintaining precise temperatures for cultures that should never have been allowed to grow, and how the methodical process of creating death could sound so much like the methodical process of creating life. Back then, medical laboratories were supposed to be places where diseases were studied, so they could be conquered, where the ancient enemies of human health were examined and understood in order to develop treatments and cures. But in the sterile corridors of Unit 731, that same scientific methodology had been turned inside out, transformed into a systematic program for perfecting pathogens that could kill on an industrial scale. The transition from individual torture to mass murder had been as carefully planned as every other aspect of Ishii's operation. The vivisections and surgical experiments conducted in the basement operating theaters had provided valuable data about human physiology, but they were ultimately limited by their scope. Each procedure could generate information about only one subject at a time. What Ishii envisioned was something far more ambitious. the development of biological weapons that could kill thousands of people simultaneously, transforming individual acts of cruelty into strategic military capabilities that could decide the outcome of entire campaigns. The scientific challenges involved in this transformation were considerable. A pathogen that killed quickly in laboratory conditions might prove ineffective when deployed in the field, where environmental factors, population density, and natural immunity could all affect its lethality. A disease that spread efficiently through direct contact might fail to propagate when dispersed through air or water supply. The gap between laboratory success and battlefield effectiveness required extensive research that could only be conducted using living human subjects under controlled conditions. This was where the systematic infection experiments began, procedures that represented a fundamental escalation in both the scope and the cruelty of units. 731's research program, rather than simply observing how diseases affected individual prisoners, the researchers began deliberately infecting subjects with specific pathogens and then studying not just the progression of illness, but the various methods by which those pathogens could be introduced into human populations. The infection protocols developed at Pingfang were designed to test every conceivable method of biological weapons deployment. Some prisoners were given injections that they were told were protective vaccinations, allowing researchers to study how various diseases spread through populations that had no reason to suspect they were under attack. Others were forced to inhale aerosolized pathogens or drink contaminated water, providing data about respiratory and digestive infection vectors that could be exploited in field conditions. The most sophisticated experiments involved the systematic comparison of different delivery methods using carefully controlled subject populations. Groups of prisoners would be exposed to identical pathogens through different routes: injection, inhalation, ingestion, and direct contact, allowing researchers to determine which methods produced the most reliable infection rates, the shortest incubation periods, and the highest mortality percentages. This was the scientific method applied to mass murder, complete with control groups, statistical analysis, and peer review of results. The pathogens selected for weaponization represented a comprehensive catalogue of humanity's most feared diseases: bubonic plague, the ancient terror that had devastated medieval Europe, became one of Ishii's primary research focuses because of its historical effectiveness and the psychological impact it could have on enemy populations. Cholera offered the advantage of rapid spread through water supplies, making it ideal for attacking civilian infrastructure. Typhoid fever could be transmitted through food as well as water, providing multiple attack vectors that would be difficult for enemy forces to defend against. Anthrax spores represented perhaps the most militarily useful pathogen because of their remarkable stability under field conditions. Unlike bacterial diseases that might die when exposed to environmental stress, anthrax could survive for decades in soil and remain viable even after exposure to extreme temperatures, chemical treatments, and other defensive measures. The researchers at Pingfang conducted extensive experiments to determine optimal methods for cultivating, harvesting, and dispersing anthrax spores in ways that would maximize their battlefield effectiveness. But the systematic weaponization of disease required more than just biological research. It demanded sophisticated engineering solutions that could deliver pathogens to target populations with the same reliability and precision that characterized conventional munitions. This challenge led to the development of specialized bomb designs that could dispersal infectious particles across large areas without killing the pathogens through the heat and shock of detonation. The ceramic bombs that would later be dropped over Chinese cities represented months of careful engineering work conducted by teams of specialists who combined expertise in aerodynamics, materials, science, and microbiology. These devices were designed to shatter at predetermined altitudes, releasing their biological payload in a fine mist that could drift for miles on prevailing winds. The ceramic construction eliminated the metal fragments that characterized conventional explosives, ensuring that the pathogen dispersal would not be contaminated by non-biological debris. Other delivery systems were developed for different tactical applications. Artillery shells could deliver biological agents to specific targets with the same accuracy that characterized conventional bombardment. Spray devices mounted on aircraft could contaminate large areas of enemy territory, making them uninhabitable for extended periods. Even seemingly innocent objects like fountain pens and walking sticks were modified to serve as assassination. Weapons that could deliver fatal doses of various toxins through casual contact. The testing of these delivery systems required extensive human experimentation that pushed the boundaries of systematic cruelty even by Unit 731's standards. Prisoners were tied to stakes at various distances from bomb detonation points to study the dispersal patterns of biological agents. Others were confined in sealed chambers where they could be exposed to precise concentrations of aerosolized pathogens, while researchers monitored their responses through observation windows. The data collected from these experiments was comprehensive and detailed, representing what was arguably the most extensive study of biological weapons effectiveness ever conducted using human subjects. What made this research particularly insidious was the way it maintained the appearance of legitimate scientific inquiry throughout the systematic development of weapons of mass destruction. The same methodological rigor that characterized respectable medical research was applied to every aspect of the biological weapons program, from initial pathogen cultivation to final field deployment. Experimental protocols were carefully designed to eliminate variables that might compromise data quality. Results were subjected to statistical analysis that met the same standards applied in academic journals. Even the most horrific procedures were conducted according to established scientific principles that had been developed to advance human knowledge and improve medical treatment. This veneer of scientific respectability was deliberately maintained through the publication of research results in peer-reviewed academic journals, both within Japan and internationally. The researchers at Unit 731 regularly contributed papers to medical conferences and professional publications, describing their work in carefully sanitized language that obscured its true nature while still allowing them to share findings with the broader scientific community. The subjects of these experiments were referred to in published papers as Manchurian monkeys, a euphemism that allowed the researchers to discuss human experimentation without explicitly acknowledging what they were doing. Papers might describe the effects of various pathogens on primate subjects, or discuss the behavioral responses of laboratory animals to different experimental conditions, using terminology that was technically accurate but completely misleading about the actual nature of the research. This academic camouflage served multiple purposes within Ishii's broader strategy. It allowed Unit 731 researchers to maintain their professional standing within the international scientific community, ensuring that they could continue to access the latest developments in medical research that might prove useful for their weapons development work. It provided a mechanism for sharing information with other Japanese research facilities without explicitly acknowledging the existence of a coordinated biological weapons program. And it created a paper trail of legitimate scientific publication that could be used to justify the facility's activities, if questions were ever raised about its true purpose. The complicity of the academic community in this deception was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire biological weapons program. Journal editors who reviewed and published Unit 731 research were either unaware of its true nature or chose to ignore evidence that might have raised uncomfortable questions about the source of the data. Conference organizers who invited Unit 731 researchers to present their findings were participating, knowingly or unknowingly, in the legitimization of systematic mass murder disguised as scientific inquiry. Even more troubling was the way that legitimate researchers outside Unit 7 built upon the published findings without questioning how such comprehensive data about human responses to various pathogens could have been obtained through ethical means. The scientific method's emphasis on reproducible results and peer review, normally the foundation of reliable knowledge, became complicit in the systematic development of weapons designed to kill civilian populations on an unprecedented scale. The institutional framework that made this academic complicity possible was the same bureaucratic structure that had allowed Unit 731 to be established in the first place. The Japanese scientific establishment, like the military and political institutions that supported Ishii's work, had collectively decided that national objectives justified the abandonment of ethical constraints that had previously defined the boundaries of acceptable research. Individual researchers who might have questioned the source of certain data could rationalize their silence by appealing to institutional authority and nationalist ideology. As the biological weapons program matured and moved from laboratory development to warfield deployment, the volume and sophistication of pathogen production at Pingfang reached industrial scales that dwarfed anything that had been attempted previously in the history of biological warfare. The facility's laboratories could produce tons of various bacterial cultures per month, quantities sufficient to supply weapons capable of affecting entire enemy armies or civilian populations. The cultivation of these pathogens required specialized equipment and techniques that had been developed specifically for military applications. Unlike medical research that might require small quantities of highly purified bacterial cultures, weapons production demanded massive volumes of hardy strains that could survive the stress of weaponization and deployment while maintaining their lethality under field conditions. The researchers at Unit 731 developed new methods for growing, harvesting, and concentrating pathogens that could meet these demanding specifications. Quality control for biological weapons production involved extensive testing on human subjects to ensure that each batch of pathogens met military effectiveness standards. Prisoners were infected with samples from every production run, allowing researchers to verify that the bacteria remained viable, that infection rates remained consistent, and that mortality percentages stayed within acceptable ranges. This testing represented the final stage in a production process that had transformed living human beings into quality assurance mechanisms. For weapons designed to kill other human beings, The systematic nature of this process reflected the institutional character that defined every aspect of Unit 731's operations. What had begun as individual acts of medical cruelty had evolved into an industrial system capable of producing death on a scale that previous generations could never have imagined. The humming of laboratory equipment had become the sound of systematic murder disguised as scientific progress, and the methodical cultivation of disease had been perfected into a form of warfare that could destroy entire civilizations while leaving their infrastructure intact for occupation by Japanese forces. But laboratory production was only the beginning of the biological weapons program's evolution, from scientific research towards strategic military capability. The pathogens cultivated in the sterile environment of Pingfang would soon be tested under field conditions that would reveal the true scope of Ishii's vision for transforming medical knowledge into instruments of mass destruction. The individual suffering documented in the facility's experimental protocols was about to be multiplied beyond anything that had previously been accomplished through conventional warfare, and the quiet efficiency of systematic murder was about to announce itself to the world through epidemics that would be indistinguishable from natural disasters, except to those who had created them. The sound of cultures growing in their incubators continued through the long Manchurian nights, a gentle mechanical breathing that measured the progress of death itself, as it prepared to leave the laboratory and enter the wider world. Somewhere in the administrative offices of the complex, deployment schedules were being coordinated with military operations that would transform experimental data into strategic weapons capable of deciding the outcome of entire campaigns. Through the systematic application of disease to enemy populations, the weaponization was complete. What remained was to test these perfected instruments of death beyond the controlled environment of the laboratory, to discover how effectively the systematic study of individual suffering could be scaled up to affect hundreds of thousands of people simultaneously. The quiet doctor's vision of medicine without ethical limitations had been fully realized. What remained was to test these perfected instruments of death beyond the controlled environment of the laboratory, to discover how effectively the systematic study of individual suffering could be scaled up to affect hundreds of thousands of people simultaneously. The quiet doctor's vision of medicine without ethical constraints was about to encounter the ultimate test of its effectiveness, the real world, where theories developed through systematic torture would be applied to populations who had no way of defending themselves against enemies they could not see, weapons they could not fight, and deaths they could not comprehend. The transition from laboratory experimentation to field deployment represented the final transformation of medical knowledge into weapons of mass destruction. As the systematic study of death prepared to leave the sterile corridors of Pingfang and enter a world that had no defense against the perfected instruments of biological warfare that Unit 731 had created, through years of methodical human experimentation, I remember the sound of freezing wind cutting across the courtyards of Pingfang in the depths of Manchurian winter. The way it could strip warmth from exposed flesh in minutes and turn human breath into crystals that fell like snow, and how that same bitter cold became another instrument in the systematic catalogue of tortures that Ishii's researchers had begun to explore beyond the boundaries of biological warfare. Back then, winter was supposed to be nature's own test of human endurance, a seasonal challenge that communities faced together through preparation, cooperation, and the accumulated wisdom of generations who had learned to survive in harsh climates. But in the experimental chambers of Unit 731, that ancient struggle between humanity and the elements had been transformed into a controlled study of exactly how much suffering the human body could endure before it finally surrendered to death. The expansion beyond biological weapons research had been a gradual process, driven partly by scientific curiosity and partly by the institutional momentum that characterizes any large organization once it has been freed from ethical constraints. The systematic study of disease had provided valuable data about human physiology under extreme stress, but it had also revealed gaps in the researchers' understanding of how the body responded to other forms of systematic abuse. If Unit 731 was to serve as a comprehensive research facility for military medicine, then it needed to explore every conceivable method by which enemy soldiers and civilian populations might be disabled, demoralized, or destroyed. This expansion of research focus led to the development of experimental protocols that pushed human endurance to its absolute limits. Procedures that served no clear military purpose except to satisfy the researchers' curiosity about the mechanics of suffering itself. The systematic nature of this work was perhaps its most disturbing characteristic. These were not random acts of cruelty committed in moments of passion or revenge, but carefully planned experiments conducted according to scientific methodology that had been stripped of every ethical safeguard that might have prevented them. Dr. Hisato Yoshimura's frostbite experiments represented the most systematic exploration of cold-induced injury ever conducted using human subjects. Yoshimura, a respected physiologist who had studied at prestigious universities and published extensively in academic journals, had developed a comprehensive research program designed to understand exactly how freezing temperatures affected human tissue and what factors might influence survival rates under extreme cold conditions. The experimental protocol he developed was elegantly simple in its cruelty. Prisoners were taken from their heated cells during the coldest months of the Manchurian winter and forced to immerse their hands and feet in barrels of water that was then allowed to freeze around their extremities. The researchers could control the duration of exposure, the temperature of the water, and the specific body parts that would be subjected to freezing, allowing them to study frostbite progression under precisely controlled conditions. What followed was a systematic study of tissue death that could have come from any medical textbook, except that the subjects remained conscious throughout procedures that should have been conducted only on cadavers. As the frozen tissue gradually thawed, Yoshimura and his assistants would strike the affected limbs with sticks, listening to the sound that frozen flesh made when hit a sound like wood being struck, completely different from the dull impact that characterized living tissue. The progression from freezing to complete tissue death was documented with the same meticulous attention to detail that characterized all Unit 731 research. Photographs were taken at regular intervals to show how frostbite advanced through different stages of severity. Temperature measurements were recorded to correlate environmental conditions with tissue damage rates. The subjects' subjective reports of pain, numbness, and other sensations were carefully noted as valuable data about the neurological aspects of cold injury. But Yoshimura's experiments did not stop at adult subjects. Children, including infants as young as 3 days old, were subjected to the same freezing procedures as part of his comprehensive study of how age affected susceptibility to cold injury. The researchers had hypothesized that younger subjects might show different patterns of tissue death due to their higher surface area to volume ratios and different circulatory systems, and they were determined to test this theory using the most direct methods available. The casual inclusion of infants in these experiments revealed the complete moral bankruptcy that had taken hold of the Unit 731 research program. These were not enemy soldiers or even adults who might be suspected of anti-Japanese activities. They were newborns whose only crime had been to be born unoccupied. Territory to parents who had fallen under suspicion by the Kempeitai. The institutional logic that could justify freezing babies to death in the name of scientific research had moved so far beyond normal ethical reasoning that it occupied a realm of systematic evil that previous generations could never have imagined. The frostbite experiments were conducted alongside other cold-related studies that explored different aspects of hypothermic injury. Some prisoners were exposed to extreme cold while naked, allowing researchers to study how rapidly body temperature dropped under various environmental conditions. Others were partially immersed in ice water to determine how long they could survive with different portions of their bodies subjected to freezing temperatures. The data collected from these experiments was comprehensive and detailed, representing what was probably the most extensive study of cold injury ever conducted using human subjects. But this knowledge had been purchased at a price that revealed the fundamental corruption of institutional science when it operates without ethical constraints. Every data point in Yoshimura's carefully compiled reports represented hours of systematic torture inflicted on subjects who had no possibility of consent and no hope of survival. The cold experiments were complemented by studies that explored the opposite extreme of environmental stress. Hyperbaric chamber experiments subjected prisoners to the crushing effects of extreme pressure changes, simulating the conditions that might be encountered by enemy pilots flying at high altitudes or divers working at significant depths beneath the ocean surface. These experiments required specialized equipment that had been designed specifically for military research applications. The pressure chambers constructed at Pingfang could simulate altitudes up to 25,000 meters, well beyond the operational ceiling of any aircraft that existed at the time. Prisoners were sealed inside these chambers and subjected to rapid pressure changes that could rupture internal organs, burst blood vessels, and cause the kinds of traumatic injuries that might disable enemy aircrews during combat operations. The progression of pressure-related injury was studied with the same systematic methodology that characterized all Unit 731 research. Subjects were monitored through observation windows as atmospheric pressure was gradually reduced, allowing researchers to observe directly how decompression affected consciousness, breathing, and other vital functions. The researchers could control the rate of pressure change, the ultimate altitude simulated, and the duration of exposure, creating experimental conditions that generated comprehensive data about human responses to extreme environmental stress. Some subjects were kept conscious throughout procedures that should have been immediately fatal, allowing researchers to gather subjective data about the experience of decompression, sickness, and other pressure-related disorders. The descriptions of pain, disorientation, and physical distress provided by these subjects were carefully recorded as valuable information about the psychological as well as physiological aspects of high-altitude injury. But the pressure experiments, like the frostbite studies, served purposes that went beyond any legitimate military application. The systematic exploration of human responses to extreme environmental conditions had become an end in itself, a form of scientific inquiry that was driven more by curiosity than by any practical need for the data being collected. The researchers had become so absorbed in the technical challenges of their work that they had lost sight of the fundamental question of whether such knowledge was worth the human cost required to obtain it. This expansion beyond military necessity was perhaps most evident in the poison gas experiments that were conducted in specially constructed chambers designed to contain and concentrate toxic substances while allowing researchers to observe their effects on human subjects. These experiments served no clear purpose related to the development of chemical weapons. Japan already possessed extensive knowledge about poison gas from its experiences during the First World War and its subsequent use of chemical weapons in China during the 1930s. Instead, the poison gas experiments seemed designed primarily to satisfy scientific curiosity about the mechanisms by which various toxic substances killed their victims. Different gases were tested in different concentrations, allowing researchers to study the relationship between dosage and lethality. Some subjects were exposed to single agents, while others received combinations of different toxins to study how multiple chemical weapons might interact within the human body. The documentation of these experiments followed the same pattern as all other Unit 731: research, careful observation, systematic recording, and clinical analysis of data that had been obtained through methods that violated every principle of medical ethics. The researchers approached poison gas testing with the same professional detachment they brought to their other experiments, treating systematic murder as simply another technical challenge that could be solved through the application of scientific methodology. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these expanded research programs was the way they revealed the normalization of gratuitous cruelty within the institutional culture of Unit 731. What had begun as weapons research with clear military applications had evolved into a comprehensive study of human suffering that served no purpose beyond satisfying the researchers' curiosity about the limits of human endurance. Starvation experiments monitored how long prisoners could survive without food under different environmental conditions. Dehydration studies determined optimal methods for denying water to enemy populations. Electrical torture experiments explored the use of controlled electrical current as both an interrogation technique and a method for inflicting precise amounts of pain without causing immediate death. Each of these research programs was conducted according to the same scientific standards that characterized legitimate medical research, complete with control groups, statistical analysis, and comprehensive documentation. But the application of scientific methodology to systematic torture had created a form of institutionalized evil that was perhaps more disturbing than random. Acts of cruelty because of its calculated, systematic character. The researchers who conducted these experiments were not sadistic individuals who had somehow infiltrated a legitimate medical facility. They were trained professionals who had been educated at the finest universities in Japan. Men who had taken oaths to preserve and protect human life, but who had been successfully conditioned by institutional culture to participate in its systematic destruction. The normalization process that made this transformation possible had been gradual and deliberate. New staff members were gradually introduced to increasingly extreme procedures, beginning with animal experiments that seemed to have legitimate scientific value and progressing through stages that slowly eroded their resistance to participating in human experimentation. By the time they were conducting torture experiments on conscious prisoners, the institutional context had made such work seem like a natural extension of their professional responsibilities. This institutional conditioning was reinforced through a system of professional rewards that recognized technical competence and research, productivity rather than ethical behavior. Researchers who generated high-quality data were promoted and given access to better equipment and more interesting experimental opportunities. Those who showed reluctance to participate fully in the research program found their careers stalled and their access to resources limited. The peer pressure within Unit 731 was intense and pervasive. Researchers worked in teams that shared responsibility for experimental design, data collection, and analysis, creating a social dynamic that made individual resistance to institutional policy extremely difficult. Anyone who questioned the ethics of particular experiments would be challenging not just official policy, but the professional judgment of colleagues whose approval was essential for career advancement. As the non-biological experiments expanded in scope and intensity throughout 1938 and 1939, the boundary between military research and pure sadism became increasingly difficult to identify. Procedures that had begun as investigations into specific military problems had evolved into comprehensive explorations of human suffering that served no clear strategic purpose. The sound of freezing wind continued to cut across the courtyards of Pingfang, carrying with it the echoes of systematic torture that had been transformed into scientific methodology. In the experimental chambers where winter had been weaponized and pain had been quantified, the researchers continued their work with the same professional dedication they had learned during their medical training, applying every technique they had been taught except for the fundamental principle that medicine exists to reduce rather than increase human suffering. But even the systematic exploration of individual agony was merely preparation for something far more ambitious. The data being collected through these extreme experiments on human endurance was intended to inform the development of weapons and tactics that could affect entire populations simultaneously. The limits of suffering that were being mapped in the laboratories of Unit 731 would soon be tested on a scale that would dwarf even the comprehensive catalogue of individual tortures that had been systematically documented within the walls of Ping. The sound of pressure chambers hissing and electrical equipment humming had become as routine as any other aspect of daily life at the facility. Somewhere in the administrative offices where deployment schedules were coordinated with military operations, plans were being finalized for field tests that would determine how effectively the systematic study of individual death could be applied to the mass destruction of enemy populations who had no way of defending themselves against weapons they could not see or understand. The institutional machinery that had transformed individual medical professionals into participants in systematic torture was now preparing to extend its reach beyond the walls of Pingfang to test whether the methodical destruction of human life that had been perfected in laboratory conditions could be successfully applied to entire cities and regions whose populations had committed no crime other than existing in territory that Japan wished to control. The limits of human suffering had been systematically mapped and catalogued, transformed from individual tragedy into institutional knowledge that could be applied with the same precision and efficiency that characterized any other form of military technology. What had begun as medical research conducted by individual doctors had evolved into a comprehensive system for the industrial production of death, ready to be deployed against populations who would have no way of understanding what was happening to them until it was far too late to mount any effective defense. I remember the sound of aircraft engines droning overhead in the summer of 1940, the way a single plane could pass almost unnoticed through skies that had grown accustomed to the machinery of war, and how something as ordinary as ceramic fragments falling like rain could transform an entire region into a laboratory where death would be studied not under microscopes but across the vast canvas of human geography. Back then, warfare still followed patterns that civilians could understand. Armies advanced across visible battle lines. Artillery announced its presence with thunder that could be heard for miles, and the distinction between combatant and non-combatant remained theoretically clear even when it was practically ignored. But what began to emerge from the research facilities of Pingfang represented something entirely new in the history of human conflict. Warfare that was invisible, silent, and indiscriminate, conducted not with bullets and shells, but with the ancient enemies of humanity itself. The transition from laboratory experimentation to field deployment had been inevitable from the moment Ishii first envisioned his program of weaponized medicine. All the systematic torture conducted within the walls of Unit 731, all the careful documentation of human suffering, all the meticulous cultivation of pathogens in sterile laboratory conditions, none of it would have any military value unless those weapons could be effectively deployed against enemy populations under real-world conditions that bore no resemblance to the controlled environment of Pingfang. What this meant, in the practical terms that military planners understood, was that the biological agents developed through systematic human experimentation would need to be tested on populations that had no idea they were being used as experimental subjects. The carefully controlled studies conducted on numbered prisoners would be scaled up to affect entire villages, cities, and regions, whose inhabitants would serve as unwitting participants in field trials designed to determine the effectiveness of weapons that could kill without announcing their presence. The first deployments had been modest affairs, limited tests that were designed more to evaluate delivery systems than to cause massive casualties. Water wells in remote villages were contaminated with cholera and typhoid bacteria, their deadly cargo introduced through methods so simple that they could be implemented by small teams operating under cover of darkness. A few grams of cultured bacteria introduced into a village's primary water source could affect hundreds of people within days, generating comprehensive data about infection rates, mortality percentages, and the speed with which biological weapons could spread through civilian populations. These early field tests revealed both the promise and the challenges of biological warfare, as it had been developed in the laboratories of Unit 731. The pathogens that had killed individual prisoners with predictable efficiency proved more variable in their effects when deployed against populations that included children, elderly people, pregnant women, and individuals with different levels of natural immunity. Environmental factors that could be controlled in laboratory settings, temperature, humidity, exposure to sunlight, became variables that could either enhance or diminish the effectiveness of biological agents once they were released into the natural world. But what the field tests also revealed was the terrifying potential for biological weapons to achieve effects that far exceeded anything that had been possible with conventional military methods. A single contaminated water source could affect more people than an entire artillery barrage. A successful biological attack could disable enemy populations for weeks or months, creating chaos that would persist long after conventional weapons had expended their destructive potential. The strategic implications of this discovery were not lost on the military planners who reviewed the early field test results. If biological weapons could be deployed effectively on a larger scale, they could potentially decide the outcome of entire campaigns without requiring the massive expenditure of conventional munitions, the deployment of large numbers of troops, or the sustained logistical support that characterized traditional military operations. This realization led to an escalation in both the scope and the sophistication of biological weapons deployment throughout Japanese-occupied China. What had begun as limited tests in remote villages evolved into systematic campaigns designed to evaluate the military potential of biological warfare under a variety of tactical and strategic conditions. The contamination of water supplies became more widespread and more systematic, targeting not just isolated villages, but entire river systems that could carry biological agents across vast distances. Teams of specialists were deployed throughout occupied territory with the specific mission of introducing various pathogens into water sources that served both military and civilian populations. The goal was not just to cause casualties, but to study how biological weapons might spread through different types of water distribution systems under various environmental conditions. The data collected from these expanded field tests was as comprehensive as anything that had been generated in the laboratories of Pingfang. Teams of researchers followed up on contamination operations, conducting detailed studies of infection patterns, mortality rates, and the secondary effects of biological attacks on community infrastructure and social organization. Villages that had been targeted for water contamination became open-air laboratories where the researchers could study biological warfare effects under conditions that could never be replicated in controlled laboratory settings. But water contamination, effective as it proved to be, was limited by geography and hydrology in ways that restricted its strategic applications. Rivers could carry biological agents only in the directions that water naturally flowed. Wells could be contaminated only if they were accessible to infiltration teams. The effectiveness of water-based attacks depended on variables like seasonal rainfall, groundwater levels, and local water consumption patterns that were difficult to predict or control from a distance. What the military planners at Unit 731 needed was a delivery method that could overcome these geographical limitations, something that could carry biological agents across enemy territory with the same flexibility and reach that characterized conventional air power. This requirement led to the development of specialized munitions that could disperse biological agents from aircraft, transforming the carefully cultivated pathogens of Pingfang into weapons that could be deployed anywhere that Japanese planes could fly. The engineering challenges involved in creating effective biological bombs were considerable. The pathogens that had been perfected in laboratory conditions were fragile organisms that could be killed by the heat and shock of conventional explosive detonation. High temperatures, sudden pressure changes, and the presence of metal fragments could all destroy bacterial cultures, before they had a chance to spread through target populations. The solution developed by Unit 731's weapons specialists was elegantly simple in concept, but fiendishly difficult to execute in practice. Instead of conventional explosive devices, they created ceramic bombs that were designed to shatter rather than explode. When they reached predetermined altitudes above their targets, these fragile containers could carry live bacterial cultures without subjecting them to the destructive forces that characterized conventional munitions. The ceramic bomb design that was eventually perfected at Pingfang represented months of careful engineering work that combined expertise in aerodynamics, materials, science, and microbiology. The bombs were constructed from specially formulated ceramic materials that would break apart cleanly when subjected to specific types of stress, releasing their biological payload in a fine aerosol that could drift for miles on prevailing winds. The payload itself was a carefully prepared mixture of bacterial, cultures, and organic materials that would help the pathogens survive exposure to environmental conditions while maximizing their ability to infect human populations. Different formulations were developed for different tactical applications, some designed for immediate lethality, others intended to cause prolonged illness that would strain enemy medical resources, and still others optimized for maximum contagion that could spread biological agents far beyond the initial target area. But the most innovative aspect of these biological munitions was not their construction, but their contents. Rather than relying solely on bacterial cultures that had to be carefully maintained under laboratory conditions, the weapons specialists at Unit 731 developed delivery systems that could carry live disease, vectors insects that had been infected with various pathogens and could continue to spread those diseases long after the initial attack. The plague flea bombs that would later terrorize Chinese cities represented the culmination of this approach to biological weapons design. These devices carried thousands of fleas that had been infected with bubonic plague under controlled laboratory conditions, insects that would survive the dispersal process and continue to spread disease throughout target populations for weeks or months after the initial attack. The cultivation of infected fleas required specialized facilities and techniques that had been developed specifically for military applications. Unlike the bacterial cultures that were grown in test tubes and petri dishes, flea production required living host laboratory rats that were infected with plague and then allowed to develop flea infestations that could be harvested for weapons production. The scale of this operation was staggering. The flea production facilities at Pingfang could generate millions of infected insects per month, quantities sufficient to supply weapons capable of affecting entire cities. The fleas were carefully sorted by species and infection status, with different strains selected for different tactical applications based on their ability to survive in various climates and their effectiveness at transmitting specific diseases. Quality control for flea-based biological weapons involved extensive testing that paralleled the human experimentation conducted in other parts of the Unit 731 complex. Batches of infected fleas were tested on prisoners to ensure that they remained capable of transmitting disease, that infection rates remained within acceptable parameters, and that the fleas themselves could survive the stress of weaponization and deployment. The field testing of these flea-based biological weapons represented the largest scale deployment of biological agents that had ever been attempted in the history of warfare. unlike the limited water contamination operations that had preceded them. The flea bomb attacks could affect populations across entire regions, creating epidemics that would persist for months and generate casualty figures that dwarfed anything that had been achieved through conventional military operations. The psychological impact of these biological attacks was as significant as their direct military effects. Populations that had learned to cope with conventional warfare, artillery bombardments, air raids, even the brutal occupation policies that characterized Japanese military administration, found themselves defenseless against enemies they could not see, weapons they could not fight, and diseases that spread according to patterns that seemed to follow no military logic. Villages that had never been strategic targets suddenly found themselves at the center of epidemics that killed more people than the largest conventional attacks. Cities that had survived years of conventional bombardment were devastated by biological weapons that required no sustained military campaign, no massive expenditure of resources, and no ongoing occupation by enemy forces. The invisibility of biological warfare created a form of terror that was qualitatively different from anything that had been experienced in previous conflicts. Conventional weapons announced their presence through noise, visible destruction, and immediate casualties that could be counted and understood. Biological weapons worked silently and slowly, creating fear that persisted long after the initial attack and uncertainty that made it impossible to know when or where the next outbreak might occur. But what made these biological attacks particularly terrifying was the way they exploited the natural human tendency to trust the fundamental elements of survival: water, food, and even the air itself. A population that had learned to take shelter during air raids, to avoid military installations that might be targets for conventional attack, and to recognize the signs of approaching conventional military operations, found that none of these adaptive strategies provided any protection against biological weapons that could be delivered through the most basic necessities of life. The scale of casualties produced by these biological weapons deployment operations remains difficult to quantify with precision, partly because the attacks were designed to produce effects that would be indistinguishable from natural disease outbreaks, and partly because the chaos created by biological warfare made systematic record-keeping impossible in many affected areas. Conservative estimates suggest that the biological weapons deployed by Unit 731 killed hundreds of thousands of people, but the true numbers may have been much higher when secondary effects are taken into account. Epidemics that began with deliberate biological attacks often spread far beyond the initial target areas, affecting populations that had no idea they had become casualties of warfare. The disruption of normal medical and public health services in war-torn areas meant that diseases that might have been contained under normal circumstances were allowed to spread unchecked through vulnerable populations. Perhaps most significantly, the biological weapons program represented a fundamental escalation in the scale of systematic murder that had begun with individual torture in the laboratories of Ping. What had started as experiments on numbered prisoners had evolved into weapons capable of killing entire populations, transforming individual acts of cruelty into strategic capabilities that could affect the course of entire military campaigns. The researchers who had perfected their techniques on thousands of prisoners in the controlled environment of Unit 731 had successfully scaled up their methods to affect hundreds of thousands of people across vast areas of occupied China. I remember the sound of a single aircraft engine droning through the autumn sky over Ningbo on October 27, 1940. The way its steady rhythm seemed no different from any of the other military flights that had passed over the city during the long years of Japanese occupation, and how something as simple as unusual materials falling like snow from a clear blue sky could transform an ordinary morning into the beginning of an epidemic that would claim more than 1,500 lives in the weeks that followed. Back then, people in occupied China had learned to recognize the sounds of the whistle of falling bombs, the thunder of artillery, the distinctive engine notes that distinguished friendly aircraft from enemy raiders. But what happened over Ningbo that October morning announced itself with no sound at all except the gentle patter of wheat grains, corn kernels, and cotton scraps landing on rooftops and in courtyards throughout the city. The attack itself was almost casual in its execution, so understated that most residents of Ningbo paid little attention to the strange debris that began falling from the sky shortly after 9 in the morning. A single Japanese aircraft flying at medium altitude through clear weather had opened its cargo doors above the city and released what appeared to be agricultural waste, the kind of organic materials that might blow around during harvest season or be discarded by farmers cleaning their storage areas. What the people of Ningbo could not have known was that every grain of wheat, every corn kernel, every cotton fiber that drifted down from that aircraft had been carefully prepared in the laboratories of Pingfang. The organic materials were not random agricultural waste, but precisely formulated carriers for thousands of plague-infected fleas that had been cultivated, tested, and weaponized according to protocols that had been refined through months of systematic experimentation on human subjects. The fleas themselves were invisible to casual observation, hidden among the grain and cotton in numbers that would have seemed impossible to anyone who had not witnessed the industrial scale of biological weapons production at Unit 731. Each carrier material had been infested with fleas that had been infected with bubonic plague under controlled laboratory conditions, insects that would remain viable and capable of transmitting disease for weeks after being deployed in this manner. The biological logic behind the attack was elegantly simple. Fleas could not survive for extended periods without host organisms, but they could remain alive long enough after deployment to seek out new hosts among the human and animal populations of target cities. The wheat, corn, and cotton provided temporary shelter and nutrition that would keep the fleas alive during the critical period between weapons deployment and host acquisition, while also serving as camouflage that would prevent target populations from recognizing that they were under biological attack. Dr. Archibald Crouch, an American missionary who had lived in Ningbo for more than a decade, was among the first to recognize that something unusual was happening in the city following the mysterious debris fall. Crouch had extensive experience with tropical diseases and public health challenges, knowledge that made him more sensitive than most residents to the early signs of epidemic disease. His diary entries from the days following the attack provide some of the most detailed contemporary documentation of how biological weapons affected civilian populations under real-world conditions. Unlike the clinical reports generated by Unit 731 researchers, Crouch's observations were motivated by genuine concern for human welfare rather than scientific curiosity, and his descriptions capture both the medical progression of the epidemic and its human impact on a community that had no way of understanding what was happening to them. The first cases appeared within days of the debris fall, initially scattered throughout the city in a pattern that seemed to reflect the random distribution of the organic materials that had fallen from the aircraft. Residents who had come into contact with the wheat, corn, and cotton began developing symptoms that were initially mistaken for seasonal illnesses, fever, chills, and general malaise that might have been attributed to influenza or other common ailments. But Crouch's medical training allowed him to recognize signs that distinguished these cases from ordinary seasonal illness: the lymph node swelling that characterized bubonic plague, the distinctive skin lesions that marked the progression of the disease, and the rapid deterioration that affected patients who had seemed healthy just days earlier, all suggested that Ningbo was experiencing the beginning of an epidemic that could affect thousands of people. What made the situation particularly dangerous was the way the attack had been designed to exploit the natural behavior patterns of urban populations. The organic materials that had fallen from the aircraft were exactly the kinds of things that residents might collect, for use as fuel, animal feed, or even food supplements during a time when wartime shortages had made all resources precious. Children playing in courtyards where the materials had landed, adults sweeping debris from their doorsteps, and merchants examining what appeared to be salvageable goods all provided opportunities for flea transmission that had been calculated into the weapon's design from the beginning. The fleas that had been dispersed throughout the city were not ordinary disease vectors, but specially selected specimens that had been chosen for their effectiveness at transmitting plague under the specific environmental conditions that characterized Chinese urban areas during autumn months. The temperature, humidity, and population density of Ningbo in October provided optimal conditions for flea survival and disease transmission, factors that had been taken into account during the planning stages of the biological attack. As the epidemic developed during the first weeks of November, the careful documentation maintained by both Crouch and Chinese medical authorities revealed the systematic nature of what was happening to the city. The disease was spreading in patterns that reflected both the original distribution of infected materials and the secondary transmission routes that characterized flea-borne illness, creating a complex epidemiological picture that would later provide valuable data for both medical researchers and biological weapons specialists. The progression of individual cases followed the classical pattern of bubonic plague, but the scale and timing of the outbreak provided information about biological weapons' effectiveness that could never have been obtained through laboratory experiments alone. The researchers at Unit 731 who had designed the attack were able to study how their carefully engineered weapons performed under real-world conditions, how environmental factors affected pathogen survival and transmission, and how target populations responded to biological attacks that they did not recognize as acts of warfare. Chinese bacteriologists who investigated the outbreak made a discovery that would prove crucial for understanding the artificial nature of the Ningbo epidemic. The fleas that were collected from plague victims and from areas where the organic debris had fallen belonged to species that were not native to the Ningbo region. Insects whose presence in the city could only be explained by deliberate introduction from outside sources. This forensic evidence provided scientific proof that the Ningbo epidemic had been caused by biological warfare rather than natural disease transmission. The non-native fleas had clearly been transported to the city and released in large numbers, a pattern of distribution that was inconsistent with any natural explanation for their presence. When this evidence was combined with eyewitness reports of the strange debris fall and the timing of the initial disease cases, it became clear that Ningbo had been the target of a carefully planned biological attack. But the scientific evidence for biological warfare did little to help the residents of Ningbo deal with the practical reality of an epidemic that continued to spread. Throughout November and into December, the medical infrastructure of the city, already strained by years of war and occupation, was completely overwhelmed by the sudden influx of plague cases that required isolation, specialized treatment, and resources that were simply not available in sufficient quantities. The Japanese occupation authorities responded to the epidemic with measures that were designed more to prevent the spread of plague to Japanese personnel than to provide assistance to the affected Chinese population. Isolation walls were constructed around the most heavily affected neighborhoods, effectively creating quarantine zones that trapped infected residents, while preventing them from seeking medical care in other parts of the city. The construction of these isolation barriers revealed the occupation authorities' prior knowledge of the biological attack and their preparation for its consequences. The speed with which quarantine measures were implemented, the specific locations chosen for barrier construction, and the resources allocated for epidemic control all suggested that Japanese military planners had anticipated the outbreak and prepared response measures in advance. The most severely affected area was Kaiminji, the district where the heaviest concentration of organic debris had fallen during the initial attack. This neighborhood bore the brunt of the epidemic throughout its duration, with infection rates that exceeded 50% of the resident population during the peak weeks of the outbreak. The systematic destruction that followed the biological attack was almost as devastating as the plague itself. I remember the sound of submarine engines humming through the depths of the Pacific in early 1995. The way their electric motors could carry vessels thousands of miles beneath enemy waters without detection, and how the mechanical rhythm of those propulsion systems marked time toward what might have been the most catastrophic biological warfare attack in human history. Back then, the ocean still seemed vast enough to hide entire fleets, deep enough to conceal weapons that could cross continents undetected, and dark enough to shroud plans that would have transformed the entire Pacific War into something resembling a biblical plague unleashed upon civilian populations who had no way of knowing they were about to become experimental subjects in the final field test of systematic murder disguised as military strategy. The strategic situation that gave birth to what would be codenamed Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night was one of desperation disguised as calculation. By the beginning of 1945, even the most optimistic Japanese military planners could see that their position in the Pacific War had become untenable through conventional military methods. American forces were advancing across the Pacific with industrial efficiency that Japanese production could not match. Soviet entry into the war seemed increasingly likely, and the bombing campaigns against Japanese cities were demonstrating a form of strategic warfare that Japan had no effective means of countering. It was within this context of approaching defeat that some elements of the Japanese military began to consider biological warfare not as a tactical supplement to conventional operations, but as a strategic weapon that might reverse the entire trajectory of the war through a single, decisive blow against the American homeland. The systematic study of mass murder that had been perfected in China through operations like the Ningbo attack was about to be scaled up to contemplate the systematic destruction of entire American cities through biological agents that could kill millions of people while leaving their industrial infrastructure intact for Japanese occupation. The operational concept that emerged from these strategic discussions was elegantly simple in its conception and terrifyingly comprehensive in its potential scope. Japanese submarines operating from bases in the Western Pacific would carry specially modified seaplanes capable of reaching the American West Coast under cover of darkness. These aircraft would be loaded with biological weapons that had been perfected through years of systematic human experimentation at Unit 731. Pathogens that could be dispersed over major population centers in quantities sufficient to create epidemics that would dwarf anything that had been achieved through conventional bombing with Sikowo or power with them bow with till pie with the soul on will on kidding will what I will The target cities selected for Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night represented the strategic and economic heart of the American West Coast. San Diego, with its concentration of naval facilities and defense industries, would serve as both a military target and a demonstration of biological warfare's capacity to neutralize enemy strongholds, without requiring sustained conventional attack. Los Angeles, as the largest population center on the Pacific coast, would provide an opportunity to study how biological weapons affected dense urban populations under conditions that had never been tested in previous operations. San Francisco, with its role as a major port and transportation hub, would allow researchers to observe how biological attacks might disrupt enemy logistics and supply networks on a regional scale. The biological agents selected for the operation represented the culmination of everything that had been learned through systematic human experimentation at Pingfang and field testing throughout occupied China. Bubonic plague, which had proven its effectiveness in operations like the Ningbo attack, would serve as the primary pathogen because of its historical associations with mass mortality and its psychological impact on target populations. Cholera would be included to attack water supplies and create secondary health crises that would overwhelm American medical infrastructure. Typhus would spread through refugee populations as people fled affected areas, creating cascading epidemics that would follow American evacuation efforts across the country. But the most innovative aspect of Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night was the inclusion of dengue fever, a mosquito-borne disease that had never been deployed as a biological weapon but offered unique strategic advantages for attacking the American mainland. Unlike bacterial diseases that required direct human contact or contaminated supplies for transmission, dengue could be spread by insect vectors that would establish breeding populations in American territory and continue transmitting the disease long after the initial biological attack. The engineering challenges involved in developing delivery systems for this transcontinental biological assault were staggering in their scope and sophistication. The seaplanes that would carry biological weapons from Japanese submarines to American cities would need to operate at extreme range under conditions that precluded any possibility of recovery or return to Japanese territory. This meant that the aircraft would essentially be biological kamikaze missions, one-way flights carrying weapons of mass destruction to targets that were thousands of miles from any Japanese base. The submarines that would transport these biological kamikaze aircraft would need to approach within several hundred miles of the American coast while remaining undetected by naval patrols that had become increasingly effective at locating and destroying Japanese vessels attempting to operate in American waters. The timing of the operation would need to coordinate weather patterns, tidal conditions, and enemy patrol schedules to maximize the probability of successful weapons deployment, while minimizing the risk of interception before the biological agents could be dispersed over their targets. The biological weapons themselves would need to be packaged in delivery systems that could survive the stress of submarine transport, seaplane launch, and high-altitude dispersal, while maintaining the viability of pathogens that had been cultivated under carefully controlled laboratory conditions. The ceramic bomb designs that had been perfected for operations in China would need to be modified for use against American cities, with payload configurations that could maximize the spread of biological agents through urban areas that were much larger and more densely populated than any targets that had been attacked previously. Quality control for these biological weapons would require testing on human subjects that exceeded even the systematic experimentation that had characterized previous Unit 731 research programs. The pathogens destined for American cities would need to be verified for effectiveness against populations that might have different genetic susceptibilities, different nutritional statuses, and different exposure to diseases than the Chinese civilian populations that had served as test subjects for earlier biological weapons development. This testing requirement led to the systematic acquisition of American prisoners of war, who could serve as experimental subjects for biological agents that were being prepared specifically for use against American civilian populations. The same scientific methodology that had been applied to Chinese prisoners in the laboratories of Pingfang was now being directed toward American military personnel who had been captured during Pacific operations, creating a direct connection between the individual torture conducted in Unit 731 facilities and the contemplated mass murder of American civilians. The strategic logic behind Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night was based on calculations that revealed the fundamental moral bankruptcy of military planning that had been completely divorced from ethical constraints. Japanese planners estimated that a successful biological attack on major American cities could kill between 5 and 10 million people within the first year following weapons deployment, casualties that would exceed the total military deaths suffered by all participants in the Pacific War to that point. But these casualty estimates represented only the immediate effects of the biological attack. The secondary consequences, refuges carrying diseases to previously unaffected areas, the collapse of medical infrastructure in targeted regions, the breakdown of agricultural and industrial production in affected areas could potentially create a cascading crisis that would affect the entire continental United States for years or even decades following the initial weapons following deployments. Deploying with the one by Poen Wells, there is input with the one will and all will go it, but all will with all a pack of water ball a quad of the cups what The psychological impact of such an attack was calculated to be even more significant than its direct military effects. American civilian populations that had been largely insulated from the direct effects of warfare would suddenly find themselves facing epidemics that killed indiscriminately, diseases that could not be fought with conventional weapons, and threats that could not be defended against using traditional military methods. The fear and panic generated by biological warfare on American soil could potentially create political pressure for a negotiated settlement that would allow Japan to retain at least some of its territorial gains from the early years of the Pacific War. What made Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night particularly terrifying was the way it represented the logical culmination of institutional evil that had begun with individual medical torture in the laboratories of Pingfang. The same scientific methodology that had been applied to systematic human experimentation was now being scaled up to contemplate the systematic destruction of entire American population centers, transforming individual acts of medical cruelty into strategic weapons that could affect the course of global civilization. The operational timeline for the biological attack called for weapons deployment to begin in March 1945, with successive waves of submarine-launched biological strikes continuing through the spring and summer months as weather conditions and operational circumstances permitted. The systematic nature of the attack plan reflected the same institutional efficiency that had characterized all other aspects of Unit 731's operations, with carefully coordinated timing that would maximize the spread of biological agents while minimizing the possibility of effective American countermeasures. But as planning for Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night reached its final stages in February 1945, the operation encountered opposition from an unexpected source within the Japanese military hierarchy. General Yoshijiro Umezu, who served as Chief of the Army General Staff and held ultimate authority over military operations of this scope, began to express reservations about the biological warfare program that went beyond tactical concerns about operational feasibility or strategic effectiveness. Umezu's objections to Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night were based partly on practical military considerations, the difficulty of maintaining operational security for such a complex operation, the uncertain effectiveness of biological weapons against populations that might have better medical care than previous targets, the possibility that American retaliation could take forms that would be devastating for Japanese civilian populations. But his concerns also reflected something that had been almost entirely absent from Unit 731's institutional culture, a recognition that some forms of warfare crossed moral boundaries that should not be violated even in the service of military necessity. The general's most significant objection to the biological warfare program was his recognition that success would create precedents and capabilities that could ultimately threaten the survival of human civilization itself. In staff meetings where Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night was discussed, Umezu argued that biological warfare represented what he called an endless battle of humanity against bacteria, a form of conflict that could escalate beyond anyone's ability to control or limit its effects. This was a remarkable moment of moral clarity within an institutional framework that had systematically eliminated ethical constraints on military planning and weapons development. Umezu's recognition that biological warfare could create consequences that would extend far beyond the immediate military objectives of Operation Cherry Blossoms at night reflected a strategic wisdom that had been almost entirely absent from Unit 731's research programs and deployment operations. The general's concerns were not based on humanitarian sympathy for potential American victims. His military career included participation in operations that had killed hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians through conventional means. Instead, his objections reflected a calculation that successful biological warfare against American cities could establish precedents that would make similar attacks on Japanese cities not just possible but inevitable, as other nations developed their own biological weapons capabilities in response to Japanese innovations. Umezu's most prescient observation was his prediction that biological warfare would ultimately earn the derision of the world in ways that would isolate Japan diplomatically and create international support for the most extreme forms of retaliation against Japanese civilian populations. He argued that the short-term military advantages that might be achieved through biological attacks on American cities would be more than offset by the long-term consequences of establishing biological warfare as an acceptable method of international conflict. The debate over Operation Cherry Blossoms at night revealed fundamental tensions within Japanese military culture, between the institutional logic that had made systematic atrocities possible and the strategic wisdom that recognized when institutional capabilities had evolved beyond the boundaries of useful military policy. The same bureaucratic efficiency that had enabled the systematic torture conducted at Unit 731 was now being applied to planning operations that could threaten the survival of human civilization, creating a situation where even committed militarists began to recognize that some weapons were too dangerous to use regardless of their tactical effectiveness. The final decision to cancel Operation Cherry Blossoms at night came in early March 1945, just weeks before the planned commencement of biological attacks on American cities. Umezu's veto was absolute and final, reflecting his authority as Chief of the Army General Staff, but also his recognition that biological warfare had evolved beyond the boundaries of military policy that could serve Japan's long-term strategic interests. The cancellation of the operation was kept strictly secret within Japanese military circles, partly to maintain operational security around biological warfare capabilities that might still be useful for other applications, but also to avoid political complications that could arise from acknowledging that Japan had contemplated biological attacks on such an unprecedented scale. Most personnel involved in planning Operation Cherry Blossoms at night were reassigned to other duties without being informed of the reasons for the operation's termination. But even as planning for the transcontinental biological attack was officially terminated, research and development activities at Unit 731 continued, at full pace through the spring and summer of 1945. The systematic human experimentation that had provided the scientific foundation for Operation Cherry Blossoms at night continued to generate data that could be applied to other biological warfare applications, and the institutional momentum of the program carried it forward even after its most ambitious strategic application had been abandoned. The cancellation of Operation Cherry Blossoms at night may have prevented what would have been the most catastrophic biological warfare attack in human history, but it did not represent any fundamental change in the institutional culture that had made such an operation possible in the first place. The same scientific methodology that had been applied to planning the systematic destruction of American cities continued to be applied to ongoing research programs that involved systematic torture and murder. On a smaller but still significant scale, what the abandoned operation revealed was the ultimate trajectory of institutional evil. When scientific capabilities are developed without ethical constraints and military planning proceeds without moral boundaries, the systematic study of individual suffering that had begun in the laboratories of Pingfang had evolved into weapons that could threaten the survival of entire civilizations, transforming medical knowledge into instruments of mass destruction that exceeded anything that had been previously contemplated in the history of human warfare. The sound of submarine engines humming through Pacific depths continued through the spring months of 1945, carrying vessels that might have transported biological weapons capable of killing millions of American civilians. If a single military decision had been made differently, the mechanical rhythm of those propulsion systems had nearly become the countdown to an apocalypse that was averted only through the moral clarity of one Japanese general who recognized that some victories would be indistinguishable from the destruction of human civilization itself. But the institutional machinery that had made Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night possible remained intact and operational throughout the final months of the Pacific War. In the laboratories of Pingfang, researchers continued their systematic study of human suffering, generating data that could be applied to future biological warfare operations that might not encounter the same ethical objections that had prevented the attack on American cities. The sound of cultures growing in their incubators continued to measure the progress of death itself, as it prepared for applications that had not yet been conceived or planned. Somewhere in the administrative offices of Unit 731, contingency plans were being developed for biological warfare operations that could be implemented if Japan's military situation became even more desperate than it had been in early 1945. The cancellation of Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night had prevented one particular application at systematic multiplication of systematic murder discarcity strategy, with the strategy the strice so to celab, where was places a skull can that disappear that will cotton on gin and do what I don't do will what the web all I still go The world had come closer to biological apocalypse than anyone outside the highest levels of Japanese military planning would ever know, saved only by the recognition that some weapons were too dangerous to use, even when military necessity seemed to demand their deployment. But the scientific knowledge that had made such weapons possible, and the institutional culture that had been willing to contemplate their use against civilian populations, would survive the war with war with war with shares. Gefoens that were selection more, or war and war with war with war and with war with war and war. With war with so with war with whatever with God. I remember the sound of fires consuming documents in the final days of August 1945, the way paper crackled and curled as years of systematic documentation turned to ash and smoke, and how the smell of burning records mixed with the acrid scent of explosives, as entire buildings were systematically destroyed to eliminate evidence of what might have been the most comprehensive program of medical torture ever conducted in the name of scientific research. Back then, surrender seemed to approach with the inexorability of a natural disaster, something that could be delayed but never prevented. And the men who had spent years perfecting the systematic study of human suffering suddenly found themselves confronted with the prospect of accountability for crimes that they had committed. With the clinical detachment of laboratory researchers recording experimental data, the orders to destroy Unit 731's facilities and eliminate all evidence of the biological warfare program came directly from Ishii himself, transmitted through channels that had been prepared for exactly this contingency. The systematic destruction that followed was conducted with the same bureaucratic efficiency that had characterized the programs, research operations reflecting an institutional capability for violence that could be turned toward eliminating. Witnesses as readily as it had been applied to conducting experiments on living subjects, the prisoners who remained in Unit 731's facilities during those final weeks of the war represented the most dangerous evidence of the program's true nature. These men, women, and children had witnessed systematic atrocities that could not be explained away as legitimate medical research, had survived experiments that revealed the calculated cruelty that had motivated so much of the facility's work, and could provide testimony that would make it impossible for those responsible to claim ignorance of the program's criminal nature. The elimination of these witnesses was conducted with clinical precision that reflected everything the program's personnel had learned about efficient killing during their years of systematic experimentation. The same medical knowledge that had been applied to studying the limits of human endurance was now directed toward ensuring that death came quickly and completely, without leaving evidence that could be used to reconstruct what had happened during the final days of the facility's operation. The research data that Ishii provided to American authorities was described in official communications as absolutely invaluable. Information that could never have been obtained in the United States because of ethical constraints that prevented systematic human experimentation. This acknowledgement of the data's value also represented a tacit admission that American researchers recognized the scientific utility of systematic torture, while maintaining that such methods were unacceptable when conducted by American personnel. The scope of the immunity agreement that protected Unit 731's leadership extended, far beyond simple protection from prosecution to include active concealment of their crimes. From international tribunals that were being established to address war crimes committed during the Pacific conflict. The men who had spent years conducting systematic torture in the name of medical research would be conspicuously absent from the proceedings in Tokyo, their crimes hidden from public scrutiny to protect the secrecy of biological warfare programs that were being continued under American auspices. The institutional momentum that had made Unit 731's operations possible did not disappear with Japan's surrender, but was instead redirected toward serving American strategic interests during the emerging Cold War. The same scientific methodologies that had been applied to systematic human experimentation were now being incorporated into American biological warfare research, while the personnel who had developed those methodologies were being protected from accountability for their crimes. Ishii himself would spend the remainder of his life as a free man, protected by American authorities who continued to find value in his expertise long after the immediate strategic circumstances that had motivated the original immunity agreement had changed. His death in 1959 represented the passing of a man who had systematically tortured thousands of people in the name of scientific research while never facing any formal accountability for crimes that violated every principle of medical ethics and international law. The other key personnel from Unit 731 followed similar trajectories, using their American protection to rebuild their lives and careers in ways that would have been impossible if they had been forced to account for their wartime activities. Many returned to prominent positions in Japanese medical and academic institutions, where they continued their research careers without acknowledging their participation in systematic human experimentation or the systematic torture that had generated much of their scientific expertise. The transformation of war criminals into protected assets reflected broader patterns in American post-war policy that prioritized strategic advantage over moral consistency. The same biological warfare capabilities that had been developed through systematic torture were now being incorporated into American weapons programs that could potentially threaten civilian populations on a scale that exceeded anything that Unit 731 had achieved during its years of operation in China. But the American decision to grant immunity to Unit 731's leadership also reflected recognition that the scientific knowledge generated through systematic human experimentation represented a form of strategic asset that could not be recreated through legitimate research methods. The data obtained through torture provided insights into human physiology and pathology that would have been impossible to acquire through ethical research, making it valuable despite its criminal origins. The institutional logic that made this Faustian bargain possible was the same logic that had enabled Unit 731's operations in the first place. A calculation that scientific knowledge was valuable regardless of the methods used to obtain it, and that strategic objectives justified the subordination of ethical constraints. The systematic torture that had generated the research data was treated as regrettable but irrelevant to the question of whether that data should be used to advance American biological warfare capabilities. The long-term consequences of this decision would extend far beyond the immediate strategic context that had motivated American cooperation with Unit 731's surviving leadership. The precedent established by granting immunity in exchange for research data would influence American policy toward other war criminals who possessed scientific or technical knowledge that could serve strategic purposes, creating a pattern of protecting valuable assets regardless of their criminal histories. The research data obtained from Unit 731 would be incorporated into American biological warfare programs that continued to operate for decades after the end of World War II, generating capabilities that could potentially threaten civilian populations around the world. The systematic torture that had produced this data would thus continue to contribute to weapons development long after the original victims had died and the original perpetrators had been granted immunity from prosecution. The sound of fires consuming documents during those final days of August 1945 had marked the beginning of a systematic cover-up that would protect the architects of systematic torture while ensuring that their crimes continued to serve strategic purposes under American auspices. The smell of burning records had been the smell of accountability being destroyed, evidence being eliminated, and justice being subordinated to calculations of strategic advantage that would influence international relations for generations to come. The institutional mechanisms that had enabled systematic torture in the name of medical research would survive the transition from wartime to peacetime, from Japanese to American auspices, demonstrating the persistent capacity of bureaucratic structures to adapt criminal methodologies to serve new strategic purposes, while maintaining the same fundamental disregard for human dignity that had characterized the original program. The Faustian bargain that traded justice for knowledge would establish precedents that extended far beyond the specific case of Unit 731, creating institutional patterns that would influence American policy toward war criminals, scientific ethics, and the relationship between strategic advantage and moral accountability for decades to come, ensuring that the systematic torture conducted in the name of medical research would continue to shape international relations long after the original victims had been forgotten and the original perpetrators had died as free men. I remember the sound of testimony being translated in a Soviet courtroom in December 1949. The way words describing systematic atrocities passed through interpreters who struggled to find language adequate for documenting crimes that exceeded normal human comprehension, and how the careful legal procedures of a war crimes tribunal seemed almost inadequate for addressing systematic torture that had been conducted with bureaucratic efficiency over a period of more than a decade. Back then, the Cold War had already established patterns of international relations that would make justice a casualty of strategic competition, and the trial proceedings in Khabarovsk represented perhaps the last opportunity for the international community to hold anyone accountable for what may have been the most comprehensive program of medical torture ever conducted in the name of scientific research. The decision to conduct war crimes trials in Khabarovsk reflected Soviet determination to pursue justice for Unit 731's crimes even after American authorities had granted immunity to the program's leadership. The systematic atrocities that had been committed throughout occupied China included numerous attacks on Soviet territory and Soviet personnel, creating jurisdiction that could not be eliminated through American diplomatic protection of the program's surviving leadership. The 12 Japanese officers who faced prosecution in the Khabarovsk trials represented middle-level personnel who had been directly involved in Unit 731's operations but had not been included in the immunity. Agreements that protected the program's senior leadership Their testimony would provide the most comprehensive public documentation of systematic human experimentation and biological warfare that would be available for decades following the end of World War II. Major General Kiyoshi Kawashima, who served as one of the highest-ranking defendants in the Khabarovsk trials, provided detailed testimony about biological warfare operations that had been conducted throughout occupied China. His confession regarding the Changde plague bombing represented official acknowledgement of systematic biological attacks that had killed thousands of Chinese civilians, operations that had been conducted with the same clinical precision that characterized all other aspects of Unit 731's activities. Kawashima's testimony was particularly significant because it came from an officer who had possessed comprehensive knowledge of Unit 731's strategic objectives and operational methods. Unlike lower-ranking personnel who might have had limited understanding of the program's broader context, Kawashima could provide authoritative documentation of how systematic human experimentation had been integrated into biological warfare operations that were designed to affect the outcome of entire military campaigns. The confessions provided by defendants in the Khabarovsk trials were described by Soviet prosecutors as being based on fact, not fantasy, reflecting extensive corroborating evidence that had been collected through investigation of Unit 731's former facilities and testimony from Chinese survivors of biological warfare attacks. The systematic nature of the evidence presented during the trials provided comprehensive documentation of crimes that American authorities had chosen to conceal in exchange for access to research data. The legal proceedings in Khabarovsk revealed the full scope of Unit 731's operations in ways that would not be possible through any other source for several decades following the end of World War II. The detailed testimony provided by defendants, combined with physical evidence and survivor testimony, created a comprehensive record of systematic atrocities that had been conducted with institutional support from the highest levels of Japanese military and medical establishments. But the international response to the Khabarovsk trials reflected the political realities of the emerging Cold War more than any commitment to justice for Unit 731's victims. Western authorities dismissed the proceedings as communist propaganda without seriously examining the extensive evidence that had been presented during the trials, reflecting strategic calculations that prioritized confrontation with the Soviet Union over accountability for systematic torture that had been conducted by Japanese personnel. The systematic dismissal of evidence presented during the Khabarovsk trials served American interests in multiple ways. It protected the secrecy of biological warfare programs that were incorporating research data obtained from Unit 731's systematic human experimentation, while also avoiding public scrutiny of the immunity agreements that had been granted to the program's leadership. The characterization of legitimate war crimes proceedings as propaganda provided convenient justification for ignoring evidence of systematic atrocities that American authorities had chosen to conceal for strategic reasons. The sentences imposed on defendants in the Khabarovsk trials were relatively lenient by the standards applied to war crimes of comparable scope and severity. All 12 defendants were found guilty and sentenced to terms in Soviet labor camps, but most were released by 1956, serving less than 10 years for participation in systematic torture and biological warfare that had killed hundreds of thousands of people throughout occupied China. The leniency of these sentences reflected both the strategic context of the trials and the difficulty of developing legal frameworks adequate for addressing crimes that exceeded previous experience with systematic atrocities. The defendants had been middle-level personnel who were following orders within institutional frameworks that had made systematic torture appear to be legitimate scientific research, creating legal complexities that traditional war crimes proceedings were not equipped to address. But despite the limitations of the Khabarovsk trials as vehicles for achieving comprehensive justice, the proceedings provided crucial documentation of Unit 731's operations that would eventually contribute to historical understanding of systematic atrocities that American authorities had chosen to conceal. The testimony and evidence presented during the trials created a public record that would be available to researchers and historians long after the strategic circumstances that had motivated the original cover-up had changed. The broader significance of the Khabarovsk trials extended beyond their immediate legal outcomes to encompass their role as the only formal legal proceedings that would address Unit 731's crimes for several decades following the end of World War II. The systematic concealment of evidence by American authorities meant that Soviet legal proceedings represented the primary source of official documentation about systematic atrocities that had been conducted with institutional support from Japanese medical and military establishments. The international isolation of the Khabarovsk trials reflected broader patterns in post-war justice that subordinated accountability for systematic atrocities to strategic competition between emerging superpowers. The same calculations that had motivated American immunity agreements with Unit 731's leadership now influenced Western responses to Soviet efforts to document and prosecute crimes that American authorities preferred to keep hidden from public scrutiny. The long-term consequences of dismissing the Khabarovsk trials as propaganda would extend far beyond the immediate strategic context that had motivated Western responses to Soviet legal proceedings. The systematic concealment of evidence about Unit 731's operations would delay comprehensive historical understanding of systematic atrocities for decades, while also creating precedents for protecting war criminals whose technical expertise was considered valuable for strategic purposes. The research data that had been obtained through systematic torture at Unit 731 would continue to influence biological warfare development in both American and Soviet programs long after the Khabarovsk trials had concluded. The scientific knowledge generated through systematic human experimentation would be incorporated into weapons development, programs that could potentially threaten civilian populations around the world, ensuring that the victims of Unit 731's experiments would continue to contribute unwittingly to biological warfare capabilities for decades following their deaths. The institutional momentum that had enabled Unit 731's operations did not disappear with the conclusion of the Khabarovsk trials, but was instead redirected towards serving the strategic interests of superpowers that were beginning to compete for global influence. The same scientific methodologies that had been applied to systematic human experimentation were now being incorporated into biological warfare programs on both sides of the emerging Cold War divide. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the Khabarovsk trials was their demonstration that comprehensive documentation of systematic atrocities was possible even when those crimes were protected by strategic considerations that made accountability impossible. The testimony and evidence presented during the trials created a historical record that would eventually contribute to public understanding of Unit 731's operations, despite American efforts to conceal evidence of systematic torture that had been conducted by personnel who were now serving American strategic interests. The decades of Japanese government denial that followed the Khabarovsk trials reflected broader patterns of institutional amnesia that characterized post-war responses to systematic atrocities throughout East Asia. The same bureaucratic efficiency that had enabled Unit 731's operations was now applied to concealing evidence of those operations, creating systematic obstacles to historical memory that would delay comprehensive acknowledgement of these crimes for several generations. The gradual acknowledgement of Unit 731's operations that began during the 1980s reflected changing international circumstances that made continued concealment more difficult to maintain. The end of the Cold War reduced the strategic value of protecting former Unit 731 personnel, while growing international attention to historical human rights violations created pressure for more comprehensive acknowledgement of systematic atrocities that had been conducted during World War II. The August 28, 2002 decision by Tokyo District Court to officially acknowledge biological warfare operations conducted by Unit 731 represented a crucial breakthrough in efforts to establish formal recognition of systematic atrocities that had been concealed for more than 5 decades. This legal acknowledgement provided official confirmation of crimes that had been documented during the Khabarovsk trials, but dismissed as propaganda by Western authorities who were protecting strategic assets. The 2018 release by Japan's National Archives of names belonging to 3,607, Unit 731 personnel represented perhaps the most comprehensive official documentation of the institutional scope of systematic human experimentation and biological warfare operations. This disclosure provided researchers and historians with access to information that had been concealed for more than 7 decades, enabling more comprehensive understanding of how systematic atrocities had been conducted with institutional support from Japanese medical and military establishments. But even this partial acknowledgement of Unit 731's operations fell far short of comprehensive accountability for systematic atrocities that had been conducted on an industrial scale throughout occupied China. The survivors of biological warfare attacks and systematic human experimentation continued to struggle for recognition that went beyond historical documentation to encompass meaningful acknowledgement of suffering that had been inflicted through institutional policies that violated every principle of medical ethics and international law. The continuing efforts of survivors and their descendants to achieve recognition for Unit 731's crimes reflected the enduring impact of systematic atrocities on communities that had been targeted for biological warfare and human experimentation. The physical and psychological trauma inflicted through these operations had affected not just direct victims, but entire communities that had been subjected to biological attacks, creating patterns of suffering that persisted across multiple generations. The sound of testimony being translated in that Soviet courtroom in December 1949 had represented, perhaps, the last opportunity for formal accountability before strategic considerations would subordinate justice to calculations of military advantage. The words describing systematic atrocities that passed through interpreters struggling to find adequate language, had documented crimes that would be concealed for decades by authorities who valued the scientific knowledge generated through systematic torture more than justice for the victims who had made that knowledge possible. The careful legal procedures of the Khabarovsk trials had seemed almost inadequate for addressing systematic torture conducted with bureaucratic efficiency. Over more than a decade, but those proceedings had created the only comprehensive public record of Unit 731's operations that would be available for several generations. Following the end of World War II, the evidence presented during those trials would eventually contribute to historical understanding that transcended the political circumstances that had initially led Western authorities to dismiss Soviet legal proceedings as mere propaganda. Somewhere in the archives of international justice, the testimony and evidence from the Khabarovsk trials continued to document systematic atrocities that had been conducted with institutional support from the highest levels of Japanese medical and military establishments. The systematic torture that had been described during those proceedings represented crimes against humanity that exceeded normal comprehension, while also revealing how easily institutional frameworks could be adapted to serve the most extreme forms of systematic cruelty when ethical constraints were systematically eliminated in the name of scientific research and military necessity. So that's the story, not polished or glorious, but frozen, bureaucratic, and unspeakably real. The story of how brilliant minds can serve the darkest purposes when institutional frameworks systematically eliminate ethical constraints. How academic respectability can provide cover for systematic torture, and how the careful language of scientific methodology can be used to disguise crimes against humanity that exceed normal comprehension. Unit 731 represents more than just a historical atrocity confined to a specific time and place. It reveals the institutional mechanisms through which systematic evil becomes possible. When scientific knowledge is divorced from moral responsibility, when bureaucratic efficiency is applied to the systematic study of human suffering, and when strategic calculations are allowed to override fundamental principles of human dignity that should constrain all institutional behavior, regardless of the political circumstances that might seem to justify their violation. The transformation of medical professionals into architects of systematic torture demonstrates how quickly ethical boundaries can collapse when institutional authority provides legitimacy for actions that would be recognized as criminal if conducted by individuals outside official frameworks. The doctors who conducted systematic human experimentation at Unit 731 were not monsters operating outside civilized society, but were, instead, respected members of academic institutions who adapted their professional skills to serve systematic cruelty while maintaining the clinical detachment that characterized their legitimate research activities. The bureaucratic efficiency that characterized Unit 731's operations revealed how institutional momentum can sustain systematic atrocities long after the original motivations that created them have been forgotten or abandoned. The careful documentation that recorded experimental procedures, the systematic methodologies that guided research protocols, and the administrative structures that coordinated complex operations all reflect organizational capabilities that could be adapted to serve systematic torture as readily as they served legitimate scientific research. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Unit 731's legacy is the way its crimes were ultimately protected and concealed by strategic calculations that valued scientific knowledge more than justice for the victims who had made that knowledge possible. The Faustian bargain that granted immunity to war criminals in exchange for research data established precedents that subordinated accountability for systematic atrocities to military advantages that could be gained through incorporating the fruits of systematic torture into ongoing weapons development programs. The institutional amnesia that concealed Unit 731's crimes for decades following the end of World War II reflects broader patterns in how societies respond to systematic atrocities that are too comprehensive to acknowledge without confronting uncomfortable questions about the institutional frameworks that made such crimes possible. The systematic concealment of evidence, the dismissal of survivor testimony, and the protection of perpetrators all served to preserve institutional legitimacy by avoiding acknowledgement of how easily respected institutions could be adapted to serve systematic cruelty. The gradual emergence of historical truth about Unit 731's operations demonstrates both the difficulty of concealing systematic atrocities indefinitely and the persistent efforts of survivors and historians to establish comprehensive documentation despite institutional obstacles that were designed to prevent accountability. The decades-long struggle to achieve recognition for these crimes reveals how historical memory itself becomes a battleground when systematic atrocities are protected by strategic interests that benefit from continued concealment. The scientific knowledge that was generated through systematic human experimentation at Unit 731 continues to influence biological warfare development decades after the original crimes were committed, ensuring that the victims of these experiments remain unwitting contributors to weapons capabilities that could potentially threaten civilian populations around the world. The institutional momentum that enabled systematic torture has been redirected toward serving strategic purposes that transcend the original political context that created Unit 731, transforming historical atrocities into ongoing components of international security competition. The legacy of Unit 731 serves as a reminder that systematic evil is not an aberration that emerges from the collapse of civilized institutions, but is instead a potential outcome of institutional development when ethical constraints are systematically eliminated in the service of objectives that are considered more important than fundamental principles of human dignity. The same organizational capabilities that enable beneficial institutional activities can be adapted to serve systematic cruelty when moral boundaries are systematically eroded through incremental decisions that each seem reasonable within their immediate context. If you're still with me after this difficult journey through one of history's darkest chapters, thank you for sharing these uncomfortable hours, for bearing witness to systematic atrocities that many would prefer to forget, and for allowing these buried truths to disturb the comfortable narratives that obscure how icily civilized institutions can be adapted to serve systematic evil when ethical constraints are systematically eliminated in the name of scientific progress or strategic necessity. I hope that somewhere in this darkness you found understanding of how institutional frameworks can be corrupted to serve systematic cruelty, how scientific knowledge, divorced from moral responsibility, can become a tool for systematic torture, and how silence in the face of documented atrocities becomes a form of complicity that enables ongoing crimes against humanity. These are not comfortable insights, but they are necessary for understanding how systematic evil becomes possible and how it can be prevented through institutional frameworks that maintain ethical constraints even when strategic circumstances seem to justify their violation. The story of Unit 731 is not just history, but a warning about institutional capabilities that continue to exist in various forms throughout the contemporary world. The scientific methodologies that enabled systematic human experimentation, the bureaucratic structures that coordinated systematic torture, and the strategic calculations that protected systematic atrocities all represent ongoing aspects of institutional development that require constant vigilance to prevent their adaptation to serve systematic evil. If this helped you comprehend these hidden chapters of history, or if you simply stayed to bear witness to systematic atrocities that shaped the development of biological warfare capabilities that continue to threaten civilian populations around the world, please like the video and subscribe if you'd like more slow journeys through history's shadows that reveal how easily institutional respectability can provide cover for systematic crimes against humanity. Let me know where you're listening from and how these stories of institutional failure resonate with contemporary concerns about how scientific knowledge and bureaucratic efficiency can be systematically divorced from ethical constraints that should govern all institutional behavior, regardless of the strategic circumstances that might seem to justify their systematic violation. Tomorrow we'll wander somewhere new, maybe warmer, maybe brighter, maybe with heroes instead of monsters who systematically tortured thousands of people while maintaining clinical detachment that transformed mass murder into scientific methodology. But still slow, still true. Still waiting for someone to remember what institutional amnesia would prefer to keep buried in classified archives and diplomatic agreements that traded justice for strategic advantage. If you're still with me, thank you for sharing this difficult hour and letting these buried truths disturb your night. I hope somewhere in the darkness you found understanding of how evil can disguise itself as progress. If this helped you comprehend these hidden chapters of history, or if you simply stayed to bear witness, please like the video and subscribe if you'd like more slow journeys through history's shadows. Let me know where you're listening from and how these stories of institutional failure resonate in our current world. Tomorrow we'll wander somewhere new, maybe warmer, maybe brighter, maybe with heroes instead of monsters, but still slow, still true. Still waiting for someone to remember what we'd rather forget. Until then, sleep well. There are more stories to come.